Hello. So, for the first time in a long time, I'm not going to begin this stream by saying good evening, but I'm going to begin this stream by saying good afternoon. Because since I'm now on vacation, since I'm taking time off from my day job, I'm getting feedback, pardon me. I am actually able to stream during the day, which is kind of nice. Um, so I'm sorry. I'm getting some feedback here, guys. I really apologize. Um, Let me see if I can fix this somehow, and I will try to. Wondering why this is not working. I hate this. Some of the really interesting. Let's see, there we go. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that, guys. So again, I wanted to do this stream because I had a free day, because I had sort of published a video. I'm trying to do less of these reaction videos, less of these drama videos. I'm trying to focus more on actually dealing with big ideas, dealing with culture, making more video essays, making more intentional content, if you will. But I still have a pulse. I'm no longer on Twitter. I deleted my Twitter account. Maybe this will come up in this stream, but I am aware of things being talked about online, and I feel it's really hard not to comment on these things, especially especially because I think people learn from online interactions, and I think a lot of people, the discourse kind of evolves online. And so I made a really quick video on my Linux laptop about Vosh and his interactions with Destiny. And this video was largely about how we process moral statements, how we process responsibility as humans, and why I believe that the philosophy of consequentialism, which is a moral approach that Vosh is he quite explicitly incorporates that into his own decision making process, why I believe that this is a really, really bad way to do basically ethics, to perform ethics, to try to hold people accountable. So, guys, guys, some before I get started on this talk, I kind of want to get some things out of the way. First of all, I'm not showing chats right now on the screen, but I will be in a little bit. And I have to warn everyone that for whatever reason, Entropy is not processing chats that come from the YouTube API. I think that's probably because they changed their protocol. And because of that, if you want a chat to appear on the screen, if you want me to be able to highlight a super chat, you're going to have to go to Entropy. The Entropy link is both in the description of this video, and also it's printed on the screen that I have here through my OBS. I know that's a little hard to read right now, but if you want to go there, if you want, I mean, I'll still read your super chats if they appear on YouTube, but at the same time, I'm not going to be able to pin it to the screen through my OBS interface unless it appears on Entropy. So if you want it to be easier for other people to read what you said, then I'd advise going over to Entropy. It's super easy. I'm not even so sure you need an account. I guess you need an account to super chat on Entropy, but I highly advise doing that because it cuts Google out of the equation. And Entropy is a less greedy actor, or a less pernicious actor, I should say, than Google is. So I highly recommend that. And also, before I get started, I know this is going to come up, but in case people are wondering what this wonderful piece of pre-Raphaelite art is, it is William Holman Hunt's 1856 piece called "The Scapegoat." So if people, on my title screen for a good few times, I think for the last three disc dances, I've had a picture of Jerusalem, the Second Temple being burned down. So one of the most famous rituals of the temple was to essentially a ceremonious during, is it Yom Kippur? I think it's Yom Kippur. It's the ceremony of repentance. So I believe this is during Passover. There is a ceremony in the old Jewish religion that said you should put all of the sins on the head of a goat, and then they're ceremoniously abandoned in the wilderness to die. And this is famously the scapegoat. I believe there's some symbolism here with the Jewish people's 40 years in the desert. So for people who are not familiar with Torahic history or familiar with the Old Testament generally, one of the central events in the Old Testament is Exodus, the journey from the Israelites from Egypt to Canaan. And this took them 40 years to travel what amounts to, the length of California, which is pretty ridiculous. But in most accounts, and I think this was the intention of the authors of the Torah, the idea of the 40 years in the desert was to essentially make a generational departure. So the generational departure was going to be placing a demarcation between the generation that was born in slavery and would necessarily have adopted an idea of subservience from the generation that was born in freedom. So that when the Israelites entered Canaan, the promised land, the one they're supposed to be native to, none of the modes of slavery would enter with them. It would be a brand new generation with a brand new perspective on life, a perspective of free men who were independent, who were there to conquer, who were there to farm, who were there to cultivate, and who were there not to be subservient or to be victims. And the reason why I'm starting with this story is it's very pertinent to the kind of broad analogies I want to draw to the movement, the time that the right is going through, and the time that we as Christians are going through too. So, as most people know, last week was Ash Wednesday. Yes, I'm counting it properly. Last week was Ash Wednesday. When you're on vacation, quote unquote vacation, or you're on quarantine or in quarantine, then all the time kind of seems to merge together and it's hard to tell exactly what day you're in. But indeed, last week was the beginning of Lent, and Lent marks the traditional fasting period. And again, this is very much like the traditional fasting period that was observed by the Jews, 40 days. I believe it's a Passover fasting period. And again, this was observed once more by Jesus in the desert when he spent 40 days in the desert. Again, the echoing of 40 is not coincidental. For the ancient Jews and for Jesus, what happened to the individual and what happened to the collective were analogous to each other. They were linked by archetype. And this is not something that's unique to the Jewish religion. This is something you'll see in all great faiths. And the general pattern of these faiths is to make sure that the archetypes of suffering that are experienced in a civilizational scale are also experienced by the individual. And this is you see this very much in ceremonies like fasting, and you also see this in ethics and self-regulation. In many ways, covenants, or saying an ethical system as a covenantal system, as a covenant between yourself and a god or yourself and a people, and I'm not going to get into the thorny bits of metaphysics. I know that there's something here that sounds like I'm saying God is a means to morality. I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is, functionally, if we look at a moral system that comes off of a covenant, what it's doing from a purely utilitarian perspective is essentially allowing an individual to carry out a moral system that would ordinarily regulate a collective. And it's saying, okay, I, in my individual actions, am molding myself simultaneously to what my collective is going through. And in the meantime, I'm also making myself more useful to others inside that collective that I stand for. And so we can see sort of an echoing, a utilitarian echo of the 40 days of fasting, both in a civilizational sense. Jesus spends 40 days fasting in the wilderness. The Israelites spend 40 years wandering in the desert. The Israelites spend 40 years wandering in the desert so that when they emerge from that period, speaking, that which is enslaved to the lower, that which is enslaved to the world, has departed from them. It's a purging period, and that sounds brutalistic and almost Darwinian, but that is essentially what's happening. In 40 years, the people will have died. They will have passed away, and the goodness that's fostered for being in the desert, for cultivating the virtue through hardship, that will be more active and more prominent. And in the same way, when a scholar or when a religious believer or when Jesus departs into the desert, he is allotting 40 days for the world to essentially pass into the distance, and for the purity of hardship to essentially bring out what is godly, good, and virtuous. And of course, the departure of that impurity in the New Testament version is literally embodied by Christ's temptation by Satan. And those are the famous 3 temptations of Christ. Of course, I think that, in most renditions of the Bible, that's not the last time Christ is tempted by the devil, but those are the most prominent narrative forms in which Christ literally speaks to the adversary and is able to tell the adversary directly, I'm done with you, I'm through with you, I am now ready to go on my earthly mission. And this is sort of, again, what I'm saying here is the moral is not exclusively, but it is a portal by which the individual actions conform themselves to the struggle that is gone through by the collective. I'm starting here, and again, the reason why I'm making this, I know this is this is quite a journey I'm taking you on. I'm starting here in 2021 with a lot of people inside the right wing, and not just the right wing, with a lot of people inside any movement that considers itself counter-mainstream, counter-liberal, counter-progressive. Anyone who's a dissident at this stage understands that they are in the desert. They are on the out. They are out of power. We are not in a comfortable place. For anyone who's Christian, and for some people who might be following other religions that have their fasting period aligned with Christianity's fasting period, usually in the spring, we're entering a period of fasting. But the purpose is the same. Collectives hone themselves morally during periods of hardship, and that hardship allows them to come out of it stronger. And that strength invariably is a moral strength. That's true for Lent, that's true for Passover, that's true for the literal 40 years in the desert. In order to really understand and to cultivate your virtue, you have to be able to subject yourself to hardship, artificially, or in the case of our collective hardships, in just a real political sense. While we're in this period of being out of power, real questions and what is ultimately important come to the fore in a way that's harder to ignore. The illusions are harder to maintain. And because of that, I think that it's an opportunity. I mean, there's a reason why, even during good times, you need to be able to artificially construct hardship. And there's no reason why our collectivity cannot use this period of hardship to learn something. The reason why I'm doing this video, the reason why I'm doing this live stream, I was thinking of doing like an actual recording, but I decided not to because this would be the obvious follow-up to do this as an actual edited video. The obvious follow-up to the Vosh video that I made, and perhaps the one I should have made as opposed to the Vosh video, is a discussion on what right-wing content creators or right-wing leaders owe to their audiences. Or not just right-wing leaders, what ethical people, what non-grifters owe to their audience. This is sort of the missing piece. So, I mean, for people who might not be up to date on what's going on or the Vosh video. So Vosh is a prominent bread tuber. He's a prominent leftist who, I mean, if we're being honest, what he essentially does is the left-wing version of Internet Blood Sports, but he does it solo. And unlike Internet Blood Sports, which was always it always had kind of a memey dimension to it. It always had this dimension where you were just doing it for the lulz. There's sort of a weird self-seriousness about Vosh. He thinks that he thinks that he's doing something that has a consequence in the world. And in a way that I don't think Andy Worski or Ethan Ralph or JF Gariepi even really did. I think they kind of understood that what they were doing was entertainment. And if you believe people like Mr. Medicare, it was always just supposed to be Jerry Springer. But in the Vosh type of Twitch streaming for politics, I should call it Destiny style, not Vosh style, because I think it was Destiny who actually streamed it. There always was this understanding that what they were doing here was meaningfully moving the conversation forward. And that was always ridiculous because the way that Vosh conducted himself was transparently dishonest. It was transparently done to obfuscate truths and to essentially make the audience feel like they were morally in the right, while putting down his opponents, regardless of the points his opponents made that probably did need to be taken on board in some form. And because of this, in the last year, basically, well, in the last 2 years, 2019 and 2020, this form of Twitch streaming that Destiny started and Vosh really made a thing has come to completely dominate left-wing discourse in a way that I can even see now ContraPoints is trying to create 8-hour gaming streams, which are terrible, and no one watches them. But everyone's trying to cash in on this thing, where you just talk to the camera continuously, you yell, you emote in this really, really over-the-top way. The people who copy Vosh, and I'm thinking here of YouTubers or Twitch streamers like Demon Mama, they always do this thing where they, holy shit, they always over-emote whenever they see something in order to signal to their audience that you need to react negatively to this thing. And for a while, this is it was sort of hard to explain why this was so popular. I guess it's in some sense it's not hard to explain, right? It is Jerry Springer drama. That's what you're selling to people. You're selling drama. You're selling self-righteousness. But it was so transparently dishonest. So in the last few weeks, Destiny has been involved in an online discussion in a few streams, but most prominently in a stream with the originator of this forum, Destiny, where he reviews the personal morality that he himself takes to the ethics of being rich. Because after 2 years of doing this, in an environment that really prioritizes streaming, in which he's been incredibly successful, he can no longer deny that he's doing very, very well for himself financially. And so one might ask a question. In a movement, a socialist movement, an anarchist movement, a Marxist movement, that largely prides itself on recentering the conversation in material terms, in refocusing moralism in material terms, in terms of who's earning the money, who's paying for what, how much money do you make, how much privilege do you have. In that environment, what responsibility do content creators, do leftist leaders have to actually practice what they preach, to actually start co-ops instead of businesses, to actually disclose the amount of money that they're earning? What responsibility do they have to give back to the community, as opposed to just spending on themselves, or perhaps even investing in the market, which inevitably goes into types of spending, types of investment, which they have in other circumstances have claimed to be totally unethical. If Vosh takes his YouTube earnings, which are quite significant in the last 2 years, at least if we were to believe him, and invests them in real estate, how is he different from the evil landlords that he's been decrying for a year? And if you listen to this stream with Destiny, he kind of contradicts himself. He tries on a lot of different positions because it's very obvious he hasn't thought about this. But the only coherent position you can get from Vosh across this entire thing is that there really is no ethical system that he's bound to respect. He can take any possible way of making money and wave it away as, well, I'm just operating in an unethical system, and the consequences of my actions aren't bad because I can tell a story about how they're not bad. And that's really it. And again, this was, he said this in a very particular way in the Destiny stream, which made it very hard to escape the consequences of this. My laptop is unplugged. Excuse me, I'm going to have to plug this back in. Okay. So hopefully that's okay. Good. He made put this in a very very stark way in the stream with Destiny, so that he could not back out of it and he could not obfuscate. There are just so many quotes of him saying things like, "You can maximize your existence under capitalism, and there's no problem with that," and all sorts of things. And Destiny holds his feet to the fire. But everyone who paid attention to Vosh throughout his entire career would have known that this was more or less his moral system. And I feel very distinctly that I kind of had Vosh's number the second I understood how he ran his Discord server. Because Vosh's favorite thing, and this is true for most leftists, his favorite thing is to play the whole gotcha around racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia. He loves doing that. In the hour of my life that I directly gave him talking to him about a year and a half ago, that's how he tried to nail me. He tried to get me with the Distributist is secretly racist. And if you say you're not racist, that means you're secretly racist even more because you're trying to deny it. This is a great gotcha, right? And he loves doing it. But as we also know, Vosh loves his spicy memes and his gamer words. And if you go back in Vosh's history, you can find any number of instances where he's saying all of the no-no words, all of the gamer words. He's implying that it's okay to genocide indigenous people. He implies that trans people are psychologically unhealthy. God forbid. He implies any number of things. He even talks about genociding certain groups that you can't even mention in a negative way on YouTube. And he gets away with it every single time. And so you must be thinking, of course, well, there's of course every time you say a spicy meme, there's always excuses for it. There always are excuses. Oh, it's a joke. Oh, I have this very very sophisticated moral system that means if you say things in this way, they're fine, but if you say things in the other way, that means you're actually serious, right? That's how Count Dankula can be a white supremacist when he dresses his pug up like Hitler, and I can advocate genocide multiple times and still be number one on the anti-racist bandwagon. There's not a bone in me, not in the slightest. I'm not racist in the slightest, but watch me advocate for genocide. The implication is always that there are some very, very sophisticated rules that embody his consequentialist philosophy. And he's doing some advanced moral calculation by which he can see that indeed the way he's saying it is cool, but the way the other person's saying it is bad. Okay, fine, maybe there is. But, and you could still be forgiven for thinking that Vosh is honest about this until you look at his Discord server. And what are the rules he uses to distinguish between language that goes too far and language that doesn't go too far on Vosh's own Discord server? I cracked up when I heard this rule. The rule on Vosh's Discord server, at least 6 months ago, was that if Vosh says it, it's all right. And if it's something that Vosh hasn't said, it's not all right. I'll say that again, and I'll try to please forgive me, I should say, for laughing at what amounts to my own joke, even though I'm just rehashing someone else's moral standard. The moral standard for language on Vosh's Discord server for a year was, if Vosh says it, it's all right. If Vosh doesn't say it, it isn't all right. So if he says an edgy meme or a gamer word, then that retroactively becomes good. And if he doesn't say it, then no one's allowed to say it and he can ban you for saying it. And I mean, this is so transparently self-interested. I mean, this is like Neolithic morality. This is like us forgetting all notions of moral consistency going back. I'm not even talking about Jesus. I'm talking about just understanding, the Babylonian moral system where there are consistent rules that apply to people of different power levels. It used to be in a Christian moral system that this was actually the exact opposite. In a Christian moral system, at least a sophisticated Christian moral system, I'll make exceptions for the fact that this might not have always been the case in all primitive forms of Christianity, although I personally think it was. In the Christian moral system, The idea was noblesse oblige. The idea was that the leader sets the highest moral standard for his community. In Vosh's world, and increasingly in the breadtube world, the standard is the leader sets the lowest moral standard for the community. The leader can get away with it because he's the powerful leader. Noblesse does not, nobility does not obligate, nobility excuses. And I'm sorry, I do not know the French for nobility excuses. But it's the exact inversion of the Christian moral system, and it is transparently self-serving. It is transparently self-serving. And really, the point of me saying this, the point of me saying all of this, and I know I'm rehashing my previous video, the point of me saying this is not to, do a one-up on Vosh. It's not to communicate, it's certainly not to communicate with Vosh. Because at this point, I think it's really, really clear that this is a grift for Vosh. He doesn't actually believe any of this, or he would live his principles. The point of me saying this is to communicate with people who are fans of Vosh, or who know people who are fans of Vosh. If Vosh is a grifter, which at this point I think it's transparently obvious that he is, his fans need to be treated generously, of course, but we need to refer to them as victims of the grift, and not people who are actually taking a serious moral perspective into a conversation with us. Serious moral perspectives do not simply scoff their way around their leaders and their moral advocates being hypocrites. And I'm not, again, this was another part of it. Saying that someone's a hypocrite in the abstract means nothing. Saying someone is a hypocrite, therefore his followers don't actually believe the morality they profess, that's quite another. So people need to learn to stop saying the left are hypocrites, the leftists are hypocrites. They need to start saying leftists don't actually care about class struggle. Leftists don't actually care about material analysis. Leftists don't actually care about bigotry or what they call racism. Leftists don't actually care about any of their principles. They only care about power. The reason why this is more effective is that it's not an indictment on the moral actor himself or herself in many instances. It's a challenge to the people who follow him to demonstrate that they actually believe something and that they actually want to live towards that something. Now, I don't remember if this is a super chat or not, but before I started this stream, someone replied to me, and maybe I'll answer this question again, but I'm going to answer it now. They asked me a question about veganism, or the ethics of eating meat. Now, there are two philosophies that I disagree with, and now I'll answer the veganism question directly later during the super chats, hopefully. And if it's a super chat, I definitely will. If it's not reply, I'll try to remember this. But there's two philosophies that generally people ask me to debate a lot, but I never feel the need to. And the first one is veganism. The second one is Islam. Why? And this is not to say I agree with them, because I disagree with both these perspectives. But the reason why I don't really feel a need to directly address these perspectives is I just respect the hell out of them relative to the other ideologies I face on this channel. Veganism and Islam are both moralistic philosophies. I think they're misguided in a few key ways. Veganism more than Islam, but both, if I'm being honest, right? But Muslims actually believe what they say. They actually try to live their ideas. I know they do. I've been friends with Muslims. And seeing Muslims pray 5 times a day, that impresses the hell out of me, because as somebody who struggles with his own prayer life, praying 5 times a day consistently is a direct challenge to me. It's like, it's like watching somebody else on an opposing football team, do a perfect kick. Man, I'm kind of angry that the other team has this guy who can do this. It's really impressive. And similarly for vegans, you can debate how healthy it is, and I will talk a little bit about how I process their ethical concerns. But it's undebatable that vegans, or, and I say this, most of the vegans who I talk to, they take their veganism seriously in its application to their personal lives in a way that I can't remember the last leftist who's taken their leftist principles as seriously as vegans take their moral prescriptions. And as such, I don't see the need to wage war on fellow moralists. I just don't. I don't understand why that's. I understand why people want to see this discussed, but to me, it's such a low priority in the grand scheme of things that I don't want to touch it. I don't want to touch it because in some ways it decenters a much broader moral position that I want to take on. The moral position that I want to take on is for the right, steering a conversation in a way that I think will actually cultivate thriving. There is an article that came out by my favorite vlogger, or favorite blogger, I should say, Mentions Molebug, about essentially how elites have historically transferred themselves. And it seems that power always transfers to another elite that is thriving but not ruling. And as people who do not see themselves as a ruling class, and I think who are very obviously not a ruling class, the way to react to being out of power is to in some ways cultivate a certain amount of thriving in some capacity. And there are some obstacles to that, but I'll get to a little bit later in this talk. One of my objects is to essentially center the question of human thriving in our conversation about politics and morality, because it is the key challenge for the right, and it is the key indictment of the left. This is something that I mentioned on my Vouch video, and I'll rehash it here again. Have people taken a look at the thriving, the lives of people on BreadTube on the left side of the internet? They're a total mess. Not only is it transparent that many of them don't believe their sort of anti-capitalist claims, their anti-capitalist moralism that gave them their platform to begin with, it's also quite obvious that they don't personally know how to manage their lives in a way that doesn't result in total train wrecks. A lot of people, I don't want to try, this isn't sort of an ad hominem, this is an observation that whatever human thriving is, it is not on display on the left side of YouTube or on the left side of the political spectrum writ large. And you can see this in cancel culture. At this stage, half of LeftTube's content is either or I should say I could probably create a partition, I should say, that completely encapsulates 90% of LeftTube content. And that is, one, identity politics posting, e.g., I am this oppressed identity group, let me tell you the right way of dealing with these people, and it's always make more concessions to me because I'm a victim. That's a little stale. The other two categories are complaining about cancel culture, e.g., either complaining about why I've just been canceled and it's unfair, or complaining about other people complaining about cancel culture and claiming it doesn't exist. And then the third part of the partition would be trying to cancel other people. Peter Coffin and Lindsay Ellis are particularly bad at this, and ContraPoints to a certain extent as well. ContraPoints and Lindsay Ellis and PhilosophyTube and Peter Coffin, they all do this. They all have videos on their channels that claim that cancel culture is a right-wing fever dream. It doesn't really exist. All it is consequences for speech. And then they all have videos on their channel complaining about themselves being canceled. with no self-awareness in the entire thing. And you can see this in smaller BreadTube channels. One of the more recent Vosh clones that I interacted with, and that I've kind of used as a template for Vosh clones writ large, is a new YouTuber, older Twitch streamer called Demon Mama. And just I think it was just yesterday, in fact, they had, maybe it was 2 days ago. It was very recently. They had this interaction with another they're both trans YouTubers, or both trans Twitch streamers. And they have this conversation about the dawning realization, and this is a dawning realization among some smarter trans people, that if the definition of woman identifies as a woman. The definition is completely vacuous and completely recursive, and it creates a logical fallacy called infinite regress, in which you essentially try to wield some kind of meaningful statement out of a vacuous statement that just continuously backs up on itself, right? The meaning of woman is identifies as woman, and woman means identifies as woman, and woman identifies as woman, and so on and so on and so forth. It's the infinite regress of mirrors, ultimately connotating nothing other than hot air. Some trans YouTubers and trans creators are realizing the problem of using this as a definition of anything. Others, like Demon Mama, don't understand why this is a problem. Yet when people try to explain this to them, when people try to explain this to Demon Mama, their reaction is to get indignant, to claim victimhood, and then to try to run a cancellation campaign against the person that tried to explain this logical feature to them on a stream. And that's the future that LeftTube has. Endless drama over cancellation, and no ability to demonstrate any kind of virtue or any kind of moral conversation that they constantly claim they want to center. I'm sorry, but I don't think that Vash is ever going to have success trying to center a serious leftist politics when he can't demonstrate that he has that nature in him. He can't demonstrate that he's serious about proper speech codes, and he can't demonstrate that he's serious about material analysis or economic analysis because he doesn't live it. And as such, the only thing he can do is say herder consequentialism gets me off the hook, and then complain about why politicians aren't doing enough. Okay, fair enough, but I'm reasonably sure that Vosh isn't going to seek higher office, not the least of which because of his long recorded history of saying gamer words. So in the meantime, it's just him getting rich off complaining about things. It's not even a really good material analysis he's giving. It's not even really an in-depth conversation about ideas. It's not even news reporting. It's just complaining about things in a completely unproduced manner. And I think that this is demonstrably going to demonstrate a lack of human thriving. For the right, in contrast, we are completely on the out of power. But at the same time, this is such an opportunity for us. In the same way that every Lent is an opportunity to grow personally, every time that you're cut off from political power is an opportunity to grow in a certain way as well. The Israelites who were wandering in the desert for 40 years, just like Jesus wandering in the desert for 40 days, were cut off in a certain way from everything that was worldly. And in that state, that state of want, they were forced to look inward to an inner vitality. That has to be what we cultivate during our time in the desert, during our time both as adherents to right-wing ideas or dissident ideas, ideas that are not in power, as adherents to religions, or as content creators and even as minor community leaders inside this entire sphere. The conversation has to be focused inwards in order to then take a next step outwards. This is paradoxical, this isn't fun, but I think, and to make this not just, again, in order for me to make this not just hollow moralism, I think that what's the onus on me here, and this is a transition, this is something I've said for a while, but this is something that I want to demonstrate on my channel, is I have to be able to come to my own audience and give them certain promises. I have to be able to say certain things like, I will never monetize my channel with ads. This is something that I consider to be not a proper use of dialectic space. Once more, I think I'll carve an exception for myself, and maybe this is a violation of ethics. If my family's in desperate circumstances, obviously, I might have to lean on something like this temporarily. But failing that, a promise I could make to you as a content creator is to never monetize this channel with promotional considerations. That's something that I feel very, very strongly about. And I think it's not inappropriate for people in my audience to come to me, and I have the right to make this a conversation. I'm not just going to obey the chat mindlessly, but they have a right to come to creators and say, I think a moral standard for our community is X, or a moral standard in our community is Y. And it's appropriate for fans to do that. It's appropriate for fans to hold to their own leaders and their own content creators to the standards that those content creators preach. If you see me doing something that's unchristian, calling me out on that is, I mean, again, we don't want to create cancel culture on the right, to be sure, but pointing that out and asking me for an apology and a moment of reflection is not inappropriate. That's not an inappropriate action. In fact, that's very appropriate. Seeing me say something that's, here's a good example, for instance. Seeing me say something that is factually inaccurate, it is appropriate to say, hey, what you said there was wrong, please issue a correction. And if I investigate and I indeed find that I said something inaccurate, then I'll issue a correction as soon as I possibly can. That is an appropriate relationship to have. Of course, there are limits. An inappropriate thing is for me to inadvertently say something incorrect, and then for you to go around and try to indict me as a liar when all that actually happened was I inadvertently misstated a fact. I mean, obviously, right? Otherwise, everyone will be canceled before you know it. I know that, for instance, this is what that no one watches this person anymore. But there was this little known content creator called Liberal Sanity Project about a year or two ago, and he tried to essentially cancel Black Pigeon Speaks because Black Pigeon Speaks forgot to properly cite one of the people he quoted. He did actually cite the person. He did actually say, hey, I'm drawing on this person's work. But when he was reading from that person's work in his video, he did not literally have a footnote at that very location saying this statement is from the person's work. This is an absolute gotcha. This is an absolute inappropriate. I mean, if Liberal Sanity's project point was, I want to comment in the video with a timestamp saying, hey guys, this quote is actually from this source, that's appropriate. That's a way of holding him to account and to make him better. But that's not what Liberal Sanity Project wanted. What Liberal Sanity Project wanted was for Black Pigeon Speaks to be completely discredited, to be taken off of the internet, and then for Liberal Sanity Project to get his little cancellation scalp so he could dance around with it and go, I'm the person who took down Black Pigeon Speaks. I destroyed the evil alt-right superstar, and now I am a celebrity. So basically what I'm asking for is for there to be moral standards, but for that not to devolve into an attempt to obtain clout or to try to game the system for gotchas. And I think that we can properly on the right make that distinction here and always. And I think that this will have to be a process of us properly and ethically using social media. If there is something that the right can do in its time in the wilderness also, it's to come up with a way of using social media that is ethical. This is something that I've been thinking about more since I got rid of Twitter. As everyone as everyone has known or knows right now, me getting off of Twitter has been a year-long process. I started trying to do this in 2019, failed, tried again, and eventually, because I failed 3 times to do this while my Twitter account was off, I had to take the nuclear option and essentially just delete the entire thing. That's because Twitter is a completely morally pathological platform. It augments the worst instincts in all of us. And I'm not just talking about cancel culture. It does encourage cancel culture. It encourages cancel culture. It encourages soundbite thinking. It encourages backbiting. But for the person who uses it, like myself, who is I tried to, as much as possible, not participate in the backbiting nature of Twitter. I noticed that in myself it encouraged lack of attention. It encouraged me, who's ordinarily already prone to being in my own head, to whenever I was operating in my own life with my family, to constantly have this little notification thing at my hip tugging at my attention and taking me away from the things that I should be dedicating attention to. There are so many ways that it was encouraging us to be unethical and worse people. The political benefit it got, I think, was really secondary. And once Donald Trump was deplatformed, once tons of people were deplatformed at the end of 2020, I think it was apparent that there was a ceiling on the political benefit it could give you. I don't really fault anyone for using Twitter, but I would ask them sincerely if what they get on Twitter is worth it. Because at this point, if you're a right winger or a dissident or a counter progressive, you now know that there is an absolute ceiling to your prominence on Twitter. And that ceiling is below, by construction, all of the blue check marks, all of the Democratic politicians, all of the left-wing grifters like Vosh, who talk about genocide and then try to indict people for racism. Your power ceiling is below all of their power levels right now. So if your idea is that you're going to use Twitter to yell louder than they are, congratulations, you've already lost. There's not even a Machiavellian justification for using that platform anymore. And without the Machiavellian justification, all you have from Twitter is a pile of psychological harms it does to yourself and a pile of moral harms it does to the community. And in that environment, I can't justify using Twitter. I can't justify using Facebook. I'm using Telegram because I want to communicate with people. I want to communicate with fans in real time. It's a useful property. But when we recreate Twitter, either on Gab or Telegram or Parler or a Signal, I'm shifting from Discord, for instance, to Matrix/Element, which I'm gonna once I finish building it, I'm going to start plugging it. But it's, I have to finish doing that, so no use plugging a platform that I'm not set up on yet. But once the point is, I should say, once we rebuild on new platforms, and we will have to rebuild to a certain extent because we cannot simply ignore social media. We cannot ignore the power of social media. The Machiavellian question never goes away, I should say. So we will have to respond to the Machiavellian reality that Twitter allows the left to organize, and we will need to rebuild right-wing ways of organizing and communicating on social media that we own and that we know is not specifically throttling our power ambitions. However, when we rebuild that system, we have to include safeguards that prevent it from becoming the moral cesspit, both personally and communally, that Twitter was for everyone and not just right-wingers throughout its entire existence. Twitter has literally robbed my generation of its attention span, and it's turned people who would ordinarily be curious about the outside world and wanting to develop their own ideas for thinking that they can develop clout by being like Vosh and completely cynical ideological grifters, or being like Faraday Speaks and Liberal Sanity Project, e.g. being tattletales, being snitches, being people who try to destroy people for clout. And Twitter has been a large part of how that mode of political communication has completely conquered my generation of millennials. When we rebuild our systems, and we have to rebuild our systems from the scratch in the desert, like Moses, who set out and spent 40 years making sure a generation had died so there wasn't that slave morality, as we take our 40 days or 40 years or 40 months in the desert rebuilding, we have to make sure that that victim mentality, that slave mentality, that evil mentality that we've adopted from being slaves on the Twitter plantation does not follow us to our new online platforms. And that certainly does not follow us to the new in real life communities that we'll build. And I think that our audience, my audience, I want to invite them to be part of that conversation. Because This isn't about the creator. This isn't about me. I'm just here speaking into a microphone. I'm just speaking into a tin can. Maybe someone's listening. Maybe someone's not, right? I'm just trying to steer a conversation that I hope is going on in other people's lives. And you are as much a part of that conversation in your interactions with me as I am in my interactions with you. And so, as we're wandering through this desert of Lent, or this desert of powerlessness that will persist maybe for a generation, at least for a few years, the conversation has to be on affecting moral thriving. And if nothing else, our experience with Vosh and Destiny can teach us the folly of the powerful, can teach us that this is the path we need to pursue. So with that, this ends the this ends the lecture portion of this distance, and I'm ready to answer questions. So as I said in the beginning of this stream, I have no ability to actually show chats from YouTube. Apparently, there's been a change in the API on YouTube, and Entropy has not been able to update their end fast enough. This happens with a lot of YouTube API hacks. YouTube DL being the Linux API hack that I like the most. But what I'm displaying here is going to be the chat from Entropy. So, I'm going to highlight the super chats or highlight the at replies that exist on Entropy because I can't highlight everything else or anything else. And after I get done with all of these things, I will go and read out the super chats. However, I literally just don't have the ability, I don't have it set up well enough to actually I don't have it set up well enough to where I wasn't prepared to have both Entropy and YouTube super chats appear on the screen. So while I will read out your super chats that come over the YouTube system after I get done with the Entropy ones, I won't be able to do that. I won't be able to literally put them on the screen. One more precaution here. I'm doing this in the middle of the day because my family is out shopping, and so I'm on vacation. I'm not doing my day job, and so they're out shopping, and this looked like a great time to stream at an unorthodox time. And I always just get a real kick out of doing this. I love doing these streams. It's great to talk to people. I might get interrupted, and I might have to cut the streams short. In that event, at 9 p.m. Pacific time, after everyone goes to bed, I will do a part 2 of this stream and answer the rest of your questions, so that I can fill out a full 3 hours, with the super chats, so that I'm not shortchanging people who were generous and gave something to me during this time. So that being said, I'm going to put a little pause here, get a drink of water, and I'll be right back. Okay, sorry about that. I think I didn't realize that the camera was on. All right, people. Just chat away in Entropy. I'm not going to be able to see the YouTube stuff. I guess I'll peek in. Looks like there's a lot of concurrent viewers. Okay, so once more, I guess I should apologize for sort of the lighting here. Me being on vacation, I'm literally just setting up my laptop in the middle of the room. I found a blank piece of wall with as few identifying features on it as possible, and I'm just broadcasting here because it's this is the best I can do under the circumstances. I don't have my usual red curtains behind me. So anyway, I see someone saying that me streaming before 1 a.m. Eastern time is like a breaking of natural law. I suppose if a breaking of natural law is being on vacation, if I didn't have a day job, I'd stream at this time all the time. It's a great time to stream. I guess I'm kind of not used to having a cup of coffee as opposed to having a small cup of alcohol. But that being said, it's perfectly fine. I enjoy it. But usually at this time I'm at work, and usually at this time the baby's running around screaming his head off too. So I guess this is an intersection of not being at work and also being temporarily not with the child. All right, let's get this going. All right, so is that appearing on the screen? Sorry here. Oh, okay, this is doing something weird. Oh dear. Okay. I apologize. It looks like I might have clicked those off. Um, Let me just scroll up to the top of this stream. Okay, here we go. I'll just do it this way. All right, highlighting this comment, bookmarking it. Okay, pardon me. Okay, so last things for $5 US. What are your thoughts on vegetarianism and the ethics of meat eating from both a personal and religious perspective? This is the question that I kind of alluded to during the actual talk. Let me see if I can't do a little bit better on the exact nature of this question for the person now. So I should say that I have no problem with vegetarianism. It's obviously ethical to be Christian and vegetarian. Should say that I kind of think that it's ethical to be Christian and vegetarian. I mean, I guess I don't really think a lot about. So for Christians, we have a moral responsibility to animals and to animal well-being. I think that this is very clear. Christians cannot be cruel to animals. We cannot be needlessly tyrannical to animals. We actually do have some concept of dominion over them. That's established. And if vegetarianism were phrased in the moral language of Christianity, it would say something like this: meat eating was essentially part of acceptable religious practice. It was part of acceptable general practice for Christians and devout people before, because it was nutritionally necessary to eat animal flesh in order to get proper nutrition to be healthy humans. Now that we have sufficient protein replacements for this process, this needs to practically align. We need to practically align our ethics so as to avoid eating animals as much as possible, to try to eat fewer animals, or to put an end to factory farming. This is, I think, a very serious moral objection, and I think that Christians definitely need to examine factory farming highly critically. If a Christian were to say to me, it's unchristian to eat meat farmed in factory farms, therefore you should never eat meat, that I take very, very seriously. I still think it's ethical enough. I still eat meat from factory farms, but I should say that I'm very, very open. I'm very, very open, and I'm very, very receptive to moral criticism coming from other religious people that says I shouldn't. I'm much more skeptical, and I'll get into this a little later in your question. I'm much more skeptical with saying that because we have meat replacements, we can never eat meat. or there's no ethical way to slaughter animals for our meat. I'm very, very skeptical of this because it seems to be that there's no natural law that says that one animal cannot one animal cannot ethically prey upon another. All animals do this. All animals kill. Usually, they kill with a minimal amount of cruelty, although we cannot say this necessarily is true in nature. There is a lot of cruelty in nature itself, right? However, I don't think that there's no way to imagine nature proceeding in any kind of ordered way without predation existing in some capacity, in some limited capacity. So, whereas I could excuse tyranny in animals as being part of a corrupted nature, it's very, very hard to say that all predation is not some kind of is outside the natural order and is demonic in origin. So it's very hard for me to say there's a hard ethical, now that we have artificial meat, there's a hard Christian ethical prohibition against meat eating. But I'm still somewhat open to it. You probably could convince me. I don't have a hard moral objection to it, in the sense that when I hear that objection, when I hear Christians say, now that we have artificial meat, you should never kill animals, even in sort of a traditional farmer killing a cow that he's raised himself sort of way. Even if the cow has had a good life. I find that's harder, but I don't have a moral objection to it. Now let's get to the critiques that I do have a moral objection to and I think are absolutely unchristian. The critiques that I have an absolute objection to, and I might actually be convinced to debate a vegan on this topic or a vegetarian on this topic, are our two moral objections. The first one is saying, now that we have a meat replacement, anyone who any as soon as we had a meat replacement of any kind, and as soon as it was possible to live without the consumption of meat products, everybody who killed animals was essentially deontologically committing murder, unnecessary murder, and that this murder has some kind of moral burden that extends beyond a misuse of an animal in the kind of Abrahamic, Toradic, or Christian sense. Is Toradic a word? From the Torah, from the Old Testament commandments. I have a problem with that because it essentially encourages us to indict our own ancestors as murderers. And I have even a worse moral objection to the arguments that come out of veganism a lot of times. That's the sort of Enlightenment perspective that because animals can feel pain, they are morally equivalent to humans, and that we are essentially all the equivalent of mass murderers because we regularly eat chicken. And we regularly must be sending thousands of birds to their deaths at Foster Farm factory farms. I have an absolute problem with that. I have an absolute problem of that in a Christian sense because it fundamentally robs us of uniqueness as humans, out of our unique moral dignity as humans. I have no problem not killing animals as part of my proper dominion towards them. I have a very big problem if we're going to start making equivocations between my child and a pig because they both have a similar level of brain activity. That is a huge problem. I have a huge problem with that. Not only from sort of the Christian point of view, where you feel that humanness has a unique property to it, but also just from a broader point of view, from a loyalistic point of view. Once we start saying that animals have the same moral worth as humans, I feel like we're committing treachery against our own collectivity. We're essentially denigrating our own collectivity by saying that we have no special loyalty to the very species we inhabit, which I believe fundamentally violates a core nature of being not just human, but any kind of animal that exists in a collective. It feels like I'm being a traitor participating in that very moral statement. And again, in a Machiavellian sense, I'll list one more objection. If we were to make that hard prohibition against meat eating, what that would inevitably result in, it would inevitably result in a modern man who's a vegetarian who sees himself as distinctly morally virtuous over all other humans who had to eat meat or who did eat meat because it was the proper way of getting a certain nutritional property out of their diets. And this is absolute poison. I hate this property about people. I hate this property about when I see it. It's mostly a leftist property, but it also occurs in liberals too. And there's a big distinction. And this is the Bugman property. Luke Smith has a great definition of Bugman. It's not just, people having the soy face. It's not people just having West Coast inflections. As everyone knows, I have a left coast inflection in my voice. People complain about it all the time. I'm sorry I was born in California. I'm sorry I have a speech impediment, whatever, but I have this progressive inflection in my voice, and a lot of people find it irritating. I don't blame them. But that's not the problem with being a bugman. The problem with being a bugman, being a bugman means that you're historically privileged. You're sitting here as the inheritor of all this moral behavior. You're sitting on top of a pile of skulls of ancestors that sacrificed for you, that went through hardships you can't imagine. And you're sitting here basically consuming that wealth that's been generated for you. And you have zero interest. The bugman has zero interest in learning about his ancestors. He has zero interest in respecting his ancestors. He has zero interest in actually paying the ancestors that forward by perpetuating himself, by perpetuating their traditions, by making sure that his species will survive into the future. And not only does he not pay it forward, not only does he not respect them, he literally indicts them. He says, I'm a better moral person because I'm not racist. I'm a better moral person because I see through the silliness of religion. I'm a better moral person because, in this case, I don't eat meat. And the rest of the people, my great-grandfather, who was a rancher, he was practically Hitler because he butchered cows. But I don't butcher cows. I've got my, I got my soy shake and my nutritional supplements built out of an industrial system that none of my ancestors had. And I can sit on my life of pure consumption and zero hardship and morally judge all of the people for doing what I consider to be evil in the past. And those people, I guarantee it, based on any notion of virtue ethics, based on any notion of sacrifice and living your own principles, those people in the past were way more virtuous than the bugman who sits in judgment of them. And that's why being a bugman is so absolutely disgusting. And you see this all the time in progressivism. And I'm not saying that I don't have elements of the bugman in me. I want to be clear about this. I don't think anybody who lives in the modern world fully comes to terms with exactly how much his ancestors sacrificed for him. Here's a good example. Free time. Okay, as a millennial, I have it, I use it. I've had to sacrifice a certain amount of free time to be able to work a job that I don't really like to support my family, which I'm happy to do. I've had to sacrifice a large amount of my free time to take care of a family that I didn't have to have. And I'm happy to do that. I love my family. It's a sacrifice I willingly make. But even after I make those sacrifices, I still have a little bit of free time to spend on this YouTube channel, which is a privilege. I get to speak to thousands of people, and I just get to talk about my opinions, and this is an absolute privilege. And not only do I get to talk to people, some of them actually give me money to say things, which is amazing, right? I mean, how privileged am I to have this opportunity to do this? And on top of that, even after you factor in, the privilege I have of being able to do YouTube videos and being able to write my opinions in blogs, which I can do on top of my work and family responsibilities, I have a little bit of time that I can do just stupid things, right? Like play board games. Like every now and then I get to play a board game. Every now and again I get to waste time, playing a dumb online creature. Oh my God, that's so privileged. I mean, even though I don't have very much time to do that, even though those things are massively curtailed relative to the amount of time I spent, relaxing before work and family and the YouTube channel, I still get to do them. I bet that very few of my answers ever had this amount of free time, in the same sense that I do. Now, some of this is not true, right? If you go back to peasants, right, in the field, they probably worked 40 to 50 hour weeks. They weren't like working 60 hours. And they had a lot of festivals that were kind of free time, right? They were kind of free time in the sense that they weren't hard labor, in the sense that they had a lot of fun doing them, in the sense that they were spending quality time with their family, right? So I don't want to say that their time was all accounted for, but at the same time, modern man does have a lot more free time and a lot more leisure than do his ancestors. He just doesn't spend it properly. And I'm guilty of that, right? If you compare me to my grandparents or to my parents, perhaps, I wouldn't be surprised that if I have more free time than they do, in a sense. In a sense that I have less obligations to other people and I have more time that are just being spent upon obligations that I've created myself. And so a lot of times I struggle with wondering if I'm doing enough to pay it forward, to do moral actions for the future. Um, I don't know. I think it's a question, but I acknowledge that the question exists, and I acknowledge that it curtails my ability to judge others. Okay, so that was a long answer, but I'm going to follow this up with a short answer from Alexander Spoonman, $15 USA. Talk about the spoon pill. I'm going to Google that. Okay, I'm sorry, Alexander Spoonman. I assume that this is in relationship to the previous question about vegetarianism, and I'm going to assume that between me answering that for a long period of time and this shrug that I did something to answer this, but I can't find any reference to the spoon pill anywhere in an initial Google search or an initial DuckDuckGo search. So I'm afraid that I'm going to have to bunt on this, punt on this one, and just thank you for your super chat. Maybe someone can clarify in chat what the spoon pill is, but I have to plead ignorance and just not being able to answer this properly. Okay, great. All right, I'm going to go on here to last things for $3 USD. Okay, so this got cut off for some reason, but I will read. Oh, so this basically is two super chats. He gave one for $3, one for $10. I'll read this question once, and I'll just highlight the full chat here. Anyway, thank you very, very much for your contributions. This chat reads, what do you recommend for a computer? What do you recommend for a computer, especially for dissident right-wingers who want to prep and adopt to the coming digital nomadism, i.e. peer-to-peer social networks, but who also might want to kick their friend's butt on Steam on occasion? Desk and laptop advice would be greatly appreciated. Well, if you want to get details on the particular system you want to use, probably the person to ask for that would be Luke Smith, who is, I don't know if he considers himself a right-winger, but he certainly is a dissident, e.g. a non-progressive, and he would have a particular opinion on that. I know he did a video about how much he loved the IBM ThinkPad. I never used that computer. I'm not really very particular about computers. I did work at a computer factory, assembly line, or literal factory, for about 3 years, and I have a computer that I built from a on-the-cheap processor that I bought there. And so I highly value that computer because I literally bought the processor off the line after doing some of the work to generate that processor. And when you ever, and of course, out of the 10,000 people working on it, does it really matter? But there's a certain sentimentality to think that some of my labor is embodied in that thing. So that computer I constructed, I highly value. But this laptop, this HP laptop that I'm working on, it could be just any other laptop as far as I'm concerned. I do have slightly more opinions about Linux. I love Linux. I'm working on Linux right now. I think it's a great system to work on. It used to be that you could hardly run anything on Linux. Now, most things you can run on Linux. There's a few programs that I can't run on Linux, but I can count that on my hand. Programs that I can't run on Linux: Adobe Premiere, Yeah, Adobe Premiere for me. That's pretty much the only program I used. Sometimes my wife and I play Magic the Gathering Arena, which is this. It's this. I don't know. It's nerd confession. I know Aaron McIntyre plays this too, so I'm slightly less bashful about it. But it's this awesome little client where you can play Magic the Gathering for free. There's not even advertisements in it. I guess the chief way they make money is by having a system where you're tempted to actually purchase privileges from them. But if you play things right and you're good, you can basically give no money and play continuously for free and play with all the updated cards. But I used to run that on Windows. That runs perfectly on Linux. Dota runs perfectly on Linux, which is not a game that I play, but a game that a lot of other people play. StarCraft 1 runs perfectly on Linux. Now, Linux is not going to have a lot of up-to-date games. A lot of them don't run on the one emulator very well at all. You're not going to run Cyberpunk 2077 on Linux. But if you have retro game tastes and if you're flexible, the system can work for you. And it also allows me to do things like shell scripting, which I love. Um, I don't know. I think, though, that there's no shame to using Windows. I think the big thing to do right now is to get the social media diet in line. I hate Bill Gates. I hate Windows. I used to hate Windows in the 2000s and late 90s. I would say, I shouldn't say late 90s because I wasn't really aware of these things in the late 90s, but I felt like it was the 90s in spirit. The early 2000s, I really hated Bill Gates because he was the big villain of Silicon Valley. And I was all into Linux and Linus Torvalds and all this stuff. I don't think Windows is a bad piece of software. In some ways, it's better than Linux. It's certainly more supported than Linux is. But it's not the problem. Windows is not the problem. Bill Gates might be the problem, but the money he's using now has pretty much all been made. The struggle right now is social media. We have got to get our social media under control. And I'm not just talking about we need to get off these platforms because our power is limited by the use of these platforms. I'm talking about these platforms are giving us attention deficit disorder. I'm talking about these platforms are sapping energy we could be spending the energy better. Now, I understand. I've been on lockdown for a year, like most people, and I've been on hard quarantine for 3 weeks. We just got off of it recently, and it coincidentally we got off of quarantine on Ash Wednesday. So, congratulations. Um, but I understand that nobody is getting off of Twitter and then going gangbusters supporting their church community. At least not in any states that I live. Nobody is getting off of Twitter and then hanging out with friends at a pub. At least not where I live. All the pubs are closed, all the churches are closed. That's not happening. So I understand that our social media diet, it's not like 1999 where you could imagine at least our public sphere has been dying. Our IRL public sphere has been dying for 20 years. But in 1999, you could imagine that getting off of Twitter meant that you were doing things more in the community. Obviously, that's not happening. But as someone who just deleted his Twitter account, it's amazing how much more present and how much more focused I am in all my other social media communications. Social media now exists for me sitting down at my computer, doing a specific thing, and then logging off again. It doesn't consist of me scrolling, right? And everyone knows this, right? Everyone has this experience where your social media is essentially you just sit on the bed and you just scroll, and you're not aware that you're just scrolling up and down the feed, watching for something that's going to catch your attention, probably because it's outrage porn or because it's some clickbait. That's not healthy. And any new platform we build has to discourage that. It has to inculcate more virtue. So, yeah, I forgot what the original question was. Oh, yeah, a computer system. I don't know. If you want to get a computer system, go to Luke Smith or build your own. Build your own probably would be good because it teaches you something about how computers work. And it's not that hard. It's not that hard to build your own. It's even cheaper. it's even cheaper, and it doesn't take that much effort. If you have a friend that knows how to do it, I highly recommend building your own. Um, that being said, and if you want to get on the Linux bandwagon, welcome aboard, brother. But the only thing that you have to do, this is an impetus for all of us, get control over your social media use. I advise using alternative platforms. I think that everyone should do that. If you have to use Facebook or Twitter, make sure that you're using it in a responsible way that's not hurting your social life more than it's actually buttressing it. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Thank you very much for the contribution, and I'm going to go on. Once more, if I have to stop this one because family returns home, then I'm just going to uh, do another live stream with the remaining questions later tonight. So there'll be a part two. Okay. Got all these windows open. Pardon me, guys. Okay, that didn't work. Why didn't that work? Huh. Okay, I apologize for this, but apparently the comment highlighter is not working. Huh, I wonder what that is. This one worked, didn't it? Okay, that worked. Okay, I guess it's working now. All right, so Dimitri Garlic for $10 USA says, a raft of questions. Thoughts on setting up Urbit? If you could do interviews with Yarvin, what would you want to discuss? Do you think dissident rightists can, in good conscience, work for the federal government? Um, well, okay, let's see. Okay, so thoughts on setting up Urbit. So I set up Urbit several times, and the reason why it's not set up now is that I used to have it running on my own private server, but because I've been doing a lot of things like moving around, I haven't gotten it set up again, and then Comcast changed my port forwarding settings, so now it's down. I personally think that the only way to successfully run Urbit is to run it on a cloud server. Currently, our problem with that is the fact that you have to purchase a cloud server space to run it, and it needs 4 gigabytes of memory. Most services that give you 4 gigabytes of memory, okay, it doesn't need 4 gigabytes. We'll make this clear. It doesn't need to actually have 4 gigabytes. It doesn't use 4 gigabytes. The Urbit language system needs to be able to see 4 gigabytes of memory. It just needs to have them there, even though it uses significantly less. So this means that I haven't found a way of cheaply running a planet on Urbit yet. I'm sure that I'll have this problem addressed when I reconsolidate my social media use. I'm buying web space directly from some people, and I might be able to get a deal where I can get 4 gigabytes of space, and then I'll be able to launch a planet permanently. I love Urbit. It's a great system. I have no idea how people are going to be able to use this in a way that's normie friendly. It's currently so normie unfriendly that it looks like it's at least a year, probably 2 or 3 years away from actually being something I could even hand to my wife or my brother and have them reasonably be expected to use it on a regular basis. So that's the question for Urbit. The question for Yarvin, I guess, I've reached out to Yarvin. I haven't heard back from him. I know he's very busy, and he's definitely stopped being as liberal with his interview time as he was earlier last year. I think when you interview Curtis Yarvin, usually he does monologues for an hour and a half. And I'm perfectly happy to let him do that because I think what he monologues on is usually fairly interesting. However, best his best conversation was not him monologuing. His best conversation was with another Ethiopian YouTuber. And I believe the Ethiopian YouTuber is under the name Elias, and they talked about the history of Christian monarchism in Ethiopia, a fascinating topic. And Curtis Yarvin was taken way, he was taken way off topic. Usually he likes talking about the history of progressivism and communism in the 1930s and so on and so forth, right? He has his own little spiel all lined up. Usually it's a reflection of his last post on his Substack. But this time he was forced to talk about Ethiopia, and he held his own really, really well. And so you could get a reactionary perspective applied to a context that was completely different. Not A context that is almost completely alien to me. It's not completely alien because I'm Christian, but it is mostly alien because it's distinctly not Western. And it was fascinating. It was one of my favorite conversations with him. So if I could wave my magic wand and somehow magically become the Mencius Moldbug Whisperer, I would try to steer his conversation on to my dream title. The dream title for my conversation with Mencius Moldbug would be "How to Be a Gentile Christian in the Modern West Effectively." How to be a white Gentile Christian in the modern West. That's what I want him to tell me. Because I never feel like this is very well fleshed out in his own worldview. I feel that the white Gentile Christian occupies a place relative to the modern cathedral, well, relative to the modern mainstream, where we're constantly under high scrutiny. Obviously, a lot of people with that title have a lot of privilege. I'm not going to deny that. We have a lot of advantages that we've been given to us and we're not respecting. And, I've addressed that in this very talk. But when it comes to living in an unapologetic way, when it comes to being a distant, when it comes to breaking with the system in an original way, it is very, very difficult to find a good language for that, being a white Gentile Christian in modern North America or Europe. And that is because the modern mainstream establishment, the modern left, is hyper-focused on that archetype as being their specific villain. And I know that Mencius Moldbug's idea is don't occupy the frame of your enemy. But given that the frame of my enemy is to center being white, Gentile, and Christian, that's front and center in their own narrative. How do I not occupy that, right? How do I not be those things? I'm certainly not going to apostatize from my religion, and I can't stop being a Gentile white. I literally can't stop being a Gentile white. Maybe some forms of Judaism would disagree with that, but as far as I understand, both Judaism and the modern mainstream notion of whiteness, I can't stop being white. My children can't stop being white, and I sure as hell am not going to apostatize. So I'm occupying the frame of my enemy because I am a white Gentile Christian. Please, Curtis Yarvin, if you could, give me some thoughts about how I can live in this identity group and live in the modern world, because I feel this is a very big missing piece of his own discussion. And I find his take very, very refreshing. But I feel that question is very underaddressed. The last question you give me is very easy. Garlic, can you work for the federal government? I think you absolutely can in good conscience. I do not think that workers who are just part of an apparatus of power are responsible for decisions made by that apparatus of power. If you are a Christian, I do not, and if you were a Christian living in the Roman Empire. I do not believe it would be unethical to become a centurion or to become a soldier in the Roman army. Many Christians did. Many saints were Roman soldiers. Now, if the army requires you to apostatize, that's a different story. And if the government requires some kind of apostasy, then it will become a different story. It currently, in my opinion, does not. So there's nothing unethical about working for the federal government because most of the federal government's operations are completely parallel to Christian moral systems. If you're asking, like, does the dissident right have a moral? I'm sure, I'm speaking from a Christian perspective here, right? I'm not speaking for all members of the dissident right because dissident right is just a broad tent community. I'm sure someone would have a moral objection to that. They'll say something like, well, in order to be part of the federal government, you have to do X, Y, and Z, which is unethical. I don't know. Insofar as NRX is concerned, NRX is a descriptive system about power. It's Machiavellian. It will make no prescriptive statements about your interaction with institutions, other than telling you that they're stupid or smart. For the most part, most government offices do not, at this time, have explicit responsibilities that run contrary to Christian moral doctrine, so there shouldn't be any problem. But keep your eyes and ears open because that could change. So, that being the case, I do not see any problem with working for the federal government as it stands currently. Although I'm open to hearing other people's opinions on that matter. Okay, last thing for USA $20. It always sounds like I'm finishing up the stream when I say that. Let's see if this one works this time. Perfect. Last thing for $12. Thank you very much. Since converting to NRX, I can't escape this feeling that I might be more comfortable in a community of strangers who share my moral political views than where I am currently, surrounded by progressive friends I have known for decades. Should I embrace this feeling or relocate? Or distrust it? P.S. I have little kids. Well, then all you're telling me is that you're in the exact same situation that I am in. So all I can say to you, last things, is that I really sympathize. Oh, hey, wait, this is last things. Okay, I assume that this is last things, the YouTube channel, in which case everyone go check out last things YouTube channel. I think he only has one video on it, but it's a really good one. I know Morgoth's review called it out as it being a particularly good video as well. I don't know if you want to keep on making videos, man, but you're off to a good start if you want to make this part of your life. You're in the same situation that I am in. I'll just tell you where I am right now. Where I am right now is I moved back. I didn't move back, but I'm on vacation in a location where there are a lot more conservatives. They're really blue-pilled conservatives. They're really normie conservatives. They're definitely not NRX. But it feels better. It feels more natural. I feel less paranoid than I did in my own hometown, occupied by progressives. Now, I don't know if this is a vacation high. I know that there's, we probably get into disagreements, but I have noticed the fact that progressives are getting, I don't think it's really so much that I have changed. It's progressives that have changed. They've changed more than I have. I was always a little conservative. I was always kind of the guy who was outspoken about various unorthodox, non-PC views. So that hasn't changed. What's happened is that progressives have become very, very shrill, very, very brittle, and very, very paranoid. So that every single time I say something, they know that I'm a heretic. They know I'm a heretic. And they're waiting for, that expression, that misstatement, that way of saying things incorrectly, where I'm actually secretly trying to smuggle wrongthink into our conversation. And so it's always on eggshells. It's always super tense. It never feels natural. It never feels like we can just shoot the breeze. Whereas when I'm with the more conservative, normie people in this smaller community on vacation, they say cringy stuff all the time where I'm like, ugh, that feels like a Republican talking point from 1996. Or, ugh, I know that's wrong. What are you going to say? Democrats are the real racists again, even though you're not even American. I hear that all the time. I cringe, I bite my tongue. But it's not offensive. And even if I did correct them, they probably wouldn't take it that personally. And if I had them in the right mood, they probably would. Whereas every single non-political statement I make towards progressives these days, since they know I'm not a true believer, their ears are on, their sensors are on, trying to figure out how I'm secretly trying to smuggle the hate speech or hate thought into the conversation. That they act like any single element of the conversation that's not curated onto one of a few topics is explicitly an attempt to undermine their own views. To the extent that talking about politics is actually the easiest thing to talk about because they're not trying to read something into the conversation that I'm not saying. So last things, I will say that I definitely see why it would be easier to move. That being said, and I'm gonna get into this a little bit. Maybe I have to do a separate live stream on this. Maybe if I do a part two, I'll do a full talk on this topic. Particularly, we need to have representation in blue areas. I just think this is not a non-negotiable. If the entirety of the distant right is located in rural areas with zero or elite representation, we are setting ourselves up for a disaster. We need to have an elite vanguard. And living in blue areas, speaking with the linguistics of blue America, is part of that equation. And I'm not so sure that I want to turn my back on this. This is something that I've continuously tried to bring up with Don the Pleb. You need elite vanguards. And I'm not when I say elite vanguards, I think he thinks I mean that we need to have a right-wing Elon Musk just come in and drop $30 billion on the movement and solve all our problems. That's not what I mean. When I say elite vanguards, I mean is you have to have people who are well established, not rich, just more or less successful, that live in blue areas, that speak blue languages, or speak with the blue accent, right? Which I kind of do, which I would lose if I lived in a red area for long enough, right? If I lived in a red area for long enough, I would start speaking like a red state American. You need to have a vanguard who lives in blue areas, who speaks with the blue intonation, and that gets invited to blue power parties, which sounds dirty for some reason, and rubs elbows with other people who have power in the blue power hierarchy, who's sympathetic to your cause and who will stick up for you in conversations. We need to have that. We need to have some kind of alliance that way. Without that, I don't think we have a feasible plan going forward. So, while I certainly feel at this stage that I'd like to live and work remotely in a red area, for so many reasons I can't count them, I'm really, part of me wants to be like, I'm going to have to be the reactionary homesteader in my blue area if I want anything to move forward. And in some sense, if I flee from this, I will give advice. I will do my own blogging career worse. But that being said, I need to refill my water. So I'm going to take another really quick break and come back to this. Okay, sorry about that. I think I have my microphone turned the opposite way. So I apologize if there's some background noise coming from that. This is the problem with entropy. I never have any idea. I never have any idea what what chart I should be looking at. I guess I should be looking at entropy. I'm always afraid that I'm gonna have no sound and I'm gonna just talk into a microphone with no one listening. Uh, See, the YouTube. This is the problem. The YouTube chat's more interesting because more people troll me there. The only thing I have going on in entropy chat are all the people who. Yeah. So if the microphone was on, I'm sorry. You heard me eating an apple and drinking water, filling up water at the fridge. So anyway, let me get back on in on this so I have a reasonable chance of finishing on time, which is in another hour. Okay, so Patrick for British pounds, is it GB? It must be British pounds, right? I mean, because isn't it no longer Great Britain? I thought it was just Britain. Didn't Tony Blair change that? Oh, this looks like it's a spicy. This looks like it's a spicy entropy chat. Okay, let's do this. Let's do this. See, I hate online drama, but even I know that it pays well. Even I know that it's fun, right? I mean, the thing about drama is you don't have to think about it. I'm going to go on a kind of a digression here, but um, people who are computer science nerds will know of the Turing test, right? So the Turing test is basically you sit in a room and someone else sits in another room. They can't see each other, and you're talking to the other person via a chat client, and or you might be talking to a chatbot or an AI, right? And the Turing test is if I can chat to somebody via this chat box and I can't tell that it's a computer after like 2 hours of talking to them, then the AI has passed the Turing test. So that's interesting, right? That's a good test for AIs. It's kind of a benchmark at least. The lighting's kind of strange here, but I'm gonna keep on going. It's a good benchmark for how it's a good benchmark for how powerful your AI is at emulating human patterns, right? But what this gets on a typical Turing test, because it's double blind, what you have is you have a lot of interactions where people are talking to people, and sometimes a person talks to another person and thinks that they're a machine. So at the end of a double blind Turing test, where you're evaluating both machines and also people, you have a certain percentage of people who will rate the machine as a person. So the machine will have a certain percentage on a Turing test, but the people will also have a certain percentage on the Turing test, usually much higher. So you'll have some people where half the people talking to them thought they were machines. This tends to happen with people who have a certain mental disability that has been turned into an online insult, and which I'm guilty of using from time to time. People with this mental challenge oftentimes talk very much like computers would when given a script to read off of. However, one person who managed the Turing tests, um, one person who checked the Turing tests, who was participating, he said, "What if we turn the Turing test into an alternative challenge, where the challenge is not to speak like a human when you're a computer, or not to speak like a computer when you're a human, because that's easy. Anyone can emulate a computer as being a human, although that might be challenging in a future date. What if the challenge is for humans to speak as much like a human as possible, to make sure that you're the most human human, in the entire Turing test if we test 100 people. And so this guy went into the Turing test saying, I want to be the most human you could possibly imagine. The person that gets confused with a computer the absolute least. So what kind of behavior is the hardest for humans to emulate, or for computers to emulate? Well, let's start from the reverse order. The type of behavior that's the easiest for computers to emulate is anger. Easy. It's drama. It's the kind of stuff that Vosh and Destiny do. It's the kind of stuff that's easiest to do when you're behaving in that way that is stereotypical of a certain mental disorder, right? Or a mental challenge. That is just if someone just goes F you, F you, F you, you're stupid, you're in bad faith, constantly. If they're constantly dismissing, constantly reframing, constantly taking the conversation off of the track and putting it on their own script, that's incredibly easy for a computer to emulate. It would be incredibly easy to program a computer to talk like Vosh. It would be incredibly easy for a computer to talk like a really pissed off person, a really pissed off customer. What's hard to do? What do only humans do really well? The things that humans do that are very, very hard for computers to do is to talk about a subject that they really love in depth and to try to convince the other person to love it as well, or to sincerely listen to the other person and to try to understand what something they love is and to try to repeat it back to them. In other words, it's very, very difficult for computers to develop deep human connections with the other party on the other side of the Turing test. And so, what I always think of, and I guess I already said this, right? But when I see Vosh, when I see his way of talking to the camera, when I see his own version of yelling and behaving and reframing, I always think of it like he's basically trying really, really hard to fail the Turing test. I would confuse him with a computer in a second if I didn't hear his voice. So Patrick, for Great Britain, $5 or £5. Did you see Vosh's video where he criticized the "Be Less White" message promoted by a Coca-Cola racist sensitivity presentation? As a white male, do you think he will become less relevant voice in the Progressive Coalition? Well, I don't know. This is the thing. I mean, the second that he defends whiteness, he could get canceled. Now, maybe here's the thing. And this is an actual very important thing to understand about Vosh. Now, Vosh has done a number of things. He said a number of things that would have gotten him canceled in any other context. If he had been on the right wing, he would have gotten canceled. If he had been a shitlib like ContraPoints, he would have gotten canceled. If he had Ben Shapiro opinions, he would have gotten canceled. If he had said any of these things, the conversations about how genocide was appropriate in some circumstances, the conversations about his opinions on alternative sexualities and identities, his conversations on whiteness, all of those would have gotten him canceled. But he's never gotten canceled. And the reason why he's never gotten canceled is that at a deep level, I think that the cancel culture crowd realizes that if they don't have Vosh on their side, if they don't have someone like Vosh covering their flanks, then they basically can say goodbye to their entire young, straight male audience for the foreseeable future. And they don't want that happening. They need to have at least a few people, or preferably only one person, like Vosh, standing there covering their flanks, ensuring all of the straight white men that there is some way to be unapologetically straight white male, if only you have the right political opinions. In essence, Vosh is sort of the porn star of LeftTube. Or of BreadTube. He is there to sell a fantasy to straight white men that if they have the proper political opinions, then they're not going to suffer any negative consequences for being straight white men in the future that progressives are very, very quickly creating for us. This illusion is very difficult to believe if you think about it for a few seconds. It's very difficult to believe if you have eyes in your head, but given the popularity of e-thoughts, given the popularity of OnlyFans, given the popularity of porn in general, you must believe that, if nothing else, the internet's very, very good at selling seductive lies to people who want to believe them, and that where it feels good and lucrative to believe those things. But a lie it is, because most of the white male audience that's young, that is following Vosh right now, and that is essentially covering for the left's own malfeasance every day, they're essentially giving the left a hard pass on politics. A hard pass. They're going to suffer serious consequences in their future lives for being part of the hated white male Gentile group. They will suffer those consequences, and there's nothing that Vosh or any of the dirtbag left is going to do to prevent that. What the dirtbag left do present, I should say, is the illusion that if only you had the right political opinions far enough to the left, there is this safe place where it's okay to be white. It's okay to be white, and it's okay also to criticize progressives when they go too far. This is an illusion. And this is similar, it's so similar to porn and really all elements of the sexual revolution. Hugh Hefner is also a fantasy. Ron Jeremy, I'm not going to explain who Ron Jeremy is, but Ron Jeremy, a porn star, is also a fantasy. The fantasy of Hugh Hefner and Ron Jeremy is that you can be ugly and old and still have all these porn stars that are interested in you, who are just sitting around salivating over you. And it's the easy availability of this incredibly perfumed, sterile sex that would never have been available even to necessarily rich men at any other time in human history. That's the illusion that Ron Jeremy and Hugh Hefner sell. It's bullshit. For a while in the 60s, in the early 60s, I should say, and this is sort of the John F. Kennedy era, after birth control, but before feminism, there was a huge group of well-off male men, and this is very much the Don Draper Mad Men crowd, who would go around and basically sleep with women. And these women would be feminine, they would be compliant, they'd be sexy, and they'd be ever so willing to sleep with these guys like Don Draper because they were alpha guys and birth control was invented, so there were no consequences. And basically, you would have all of the benefit for none of the cost if you were a guy. Eventually, women caught on, and they saw that they were being screwed over, and they got angry. They realized that the men were exploiting them because they were exploiting the sexual market when they had the advantage. And then suddenly all of these mistresses would be 30, 40, and they wouldn't have husbands. They got screwed over. So, then they realized that you couldn't have this sexist alpha male character get in on this. And the reason why, as long as it was like 5 men doing this, or a handful of men at the elites, it was passable. As long as maybe only really rich men did it, it was passable. But once all guys tried to do it, it was very, very obvious that this was unsustainable. And the same thing is true for Vosh. I'm sorry, I probably said Vaush a few times, but it's Vosh. But the same thing is true for Vosh. If it's one bread tuber being unapologetically white, we can manage it, right? It works. We can manage it. It's all right. If it's 3 or 4, yeah, sure. However, if doing a Vosh is something that everybody can do, if every progressive male who's an anarchist can behave like Vosh in progressive circles, progressivism will collapse. They can't have that happen. If any white male can go into a progressive space and they start talking like Vosh, talking over people, putting them in their place, asserting his ability to be unapologetically white, and saying that that stems from the fact that he has better arguments. All of a sudden, all of the other progressive client groups that thought they were getting a better deal from progressivism will start complaining. And the leaders of progressivism will either admit to their client groups that everything that they sold them in wokeness is a lie, or they'll have to smack down on the people who are behaving like Vosh is behaving. And my money is that they'll smack down on the people who are behaving like Vosh is behaving. If Vosh's fans think that they can behave like Vosh in progressive circles, they have got another thing coming. And I think that the only reason that they even think that this is a possibility in a post-left future is because they are so online, they've never actually tried to do this in real life. White men are not allowed to behave like that in actual progressive circles. I know this from being in progressive circles for most of my life. They get pushed back on, or the progressive circle loses its credibility as a safe place for progressive groups. And I don't know. Once the rest of Vosh's fans go into the real world and they realize that the myth that Vosh has sold them is a lie, that essentially this is not Vosh proposing a new way of being a white male, but simply bragging that he's joined a specific aristocracy that by definition could never grow very much beyond a specific set of e-celebrities, I think that his fan base is going to get really angry at him. You know, I'll say this about Christianity, but the life that I try to model, I mean, I'm not modeling a life here, right? But the life that Christians talk about and try to model as much as possible, it's not an unsustainable life. It's what I'm doing right now is not something that if everyone did it, the system would collapse. In fact, if everyone did what I'm doing now, the system probably would be a lot better than it is, in my opinion. And 60 years ago, almost everyone was doing what I'm doing. In a sense, they had the same cultural mores as I did. And in many ways, society was way more cohesive. In this way, this is what's called, this standard is called the deontological standard, right? It's similar to the categorical imperative from Kant. In this way, it's quite easy to see why right-wing ideas and right-wing moral standards are superior to the ones currently being put forward by the left. But yeah, I think this, if Vosh goes full defender of the white man in progressive circles, I think it'll be the beginning of the end. But anyway, I'm going to go on with the hope of actually getting to the end of these things. So Sam153 for $10 USA says, happy vacation. Well, thank you very much. Forgive me for going on because I've got a lot of these chats to get through. Oh, and I saw someone super chat me asking whether the questions will be answered. The super chats will be answered in the order that they come. I can't... Now, I know I said that I'd prioritize the questions in terms of the time. Maybe I should do that. Maybe I should prioritize the super chats posted in the actual questions bar. But as for the questions that are not super chats, I'll try to answer them at the end of my time if I have time to do it. They're more or less the equivalent of an @ reply that I can see. But let's take this a little bit out of order and do this one from the questions bar. Ghost of Chesterton for $10. Long-time listener, first-time caller. I love that expression. Maybe this should be a call-in show. That might be interesting. I almost feel bad accepting money for this stuff. My family does kind of need it at this stage. Word of advice, guys: figure out where you're going to permanently live before you start your family, because once you start moving around, your family expenses exponentially increase. But we're really thankful for the donation. Ghost of Chesterton for $10 USA. Long-time listener, first-time caller. What would your advice be for dissidents who are preparing to work in academia or that are currently there? Is there any good they can do within the machine? I agree with your take that infiltration is morally hazardous and unlikely to be effective. But is there any other way to use that kind of position wisely? So about 3 years ago, this is one of the earlier videos I did on my channel. I did a video entitled, I'm forgetting what the title of the video was, but the sub video was, the portion was called "Striking from Within the Walls." Oh no, I remember the series was called "Resisting Progressive Institutions," and in there I spoke more tactically than strategically about how you could try to pose in plain sight. So just to be clear, I'll restate this for people who don't know. Obviously, Ghost of Chesterton understands that I'm going to say this. A lot of people, a lot of people on the distant right, mostly people who are new to the distant right, they perceive entryism as being a good strategy. And entryism is essentially you try to work your way up through the ladders in the system so that you can get into a position of power and then wield that against the system. This is essentially what worked for the left for the longest time. In my experience, this does not work for the right. This is part of the asymmetrical nature of politics. I think it just generally doesn't work for right wingers because of the entropic nature of the left. Things always become more left wing. So it's there's that element of it. But the other reason why entryism doesn't work is that the opposition is hyper aware of you, right? So they're so paranoid that the only way to infiltrate is to be a really, really good copy of a leftist. But the problem is, as a lot of people in the system might point out, everyone has a tendency to become what they pretend to be. And if you're a really, really good fake copy of a leftist, after 30 years of working in your profession, you might just end up becoming a leftist. If the system survives for that long, it's more likely to change you than you were to change it, considering that it's so paranoid about right-wing ideas becoming active in its own system. So that is a huge problem for entryism. But if you're going that way anyway, my tactical suggestions in that video I mentioned was that entryism is hard and it's not advisable for everyone. But if you have to be in that situation, the place where you want to be is of the skeptic and of the artist. So the best good you can do as a person who's inside the system is to not be a public advocate for your worldview, because that will get you fired most likely. If I'm assuming that you have a conservative or reactionary worldview, then you'll probably I would definitely not recommend using a position of power to preach that, because that's going to result in retaliation. I think I might have to end the thing soon, but the best way to do this is to essentially become a skeptic, to essentially shift into low gear, and to talk about artistic movements, and then to provide a sympathetic voice to people who are on the outside. So I'm suspicious that maybe people are coming home right now, and I might have to end the stream sooner rather than later. Let me check to see this. No, I'm not saying that. Maybe I can keep on going. So, okay. I'm going to assume that I can keep on going. I apologize for that little hiccup. Someone was approaching the door, and I'm like, I don't want to have side noise coming into the stream. So tactically speaking, if you're infiltrating, you want to essentially lead by example. You want to be a moral witness in the institution where you occupy. You do not want to be an ideological witness. And in addition to and it's not just being a moral witness, because I think that's what a lot of people miss too. It's also being an artistic witness. If you are inside an institution and you bear witness to what's good and what's beautiful, two things that it's very, very difficult for an institution to crack down on, then you will be doing work to bring forward something new inside the system where you operate in a much more sophisticated way than you might initially imagine. it's much more effective than the speaking truth to power. Speaking truth to power institutionally does not work for right wingers. It never has. And it probably doesn't work to anyone who's actually dissident and doesn't have some kind of vanguard defending them. So, someone's doing something outside the door, so I'll keep on going here. So thank you for that. I hope I wish I could have done a better job answering that. Maybe I'll return to the question as I go through the other super chats. Um, okay, so Aristocratic Owl for $10. I'm someone who loves the Victorian age slash I think what we would call the Regency in America and England. Yeah, I think the Regency and the Victorian age. How can how can I integrate both aesthetically and culturally this world into modern culture? Best option I think of is the concept of oikos being brought up by this late Sir Roger Scruton. Now, okay, I'm so glad you asked me this. Not really because I have a good answer for you, but because I have a good story. Um, so there's two communities that I was kind of one that I was more part of than the other one, right? One I just dipped my toe in. One I was genuinely part of. So when I was in high school, and I probably will do a Trad Codex series on this eventually, but those take me so long to make that I don't want to make any promises. But when I was in high school, I was really into anime, right? And I was, even back then, I was kind of an old fuddy-duddy. I really liked the Victorian aesthetic. I was a reader of old books in a way that most of my contemporaries were not. And when I saw anime, I'm like, bam, that's exactly what I want. That's the vision for the future. It's futuristic, but it copies the aesthetics of the Victorian era. And also, if you look into anime, it also copies their virtue. Like loyalty. The women are all women. The men are all men. Well, maybe the men aren't all men. They're kind of effeminate. Or actually, they're increasingly effeminate in most modern anime. But still, every now and again, you get kind of that samurai character in anime. The real image of the stoic man. And so the masculine image is still there for every one of the nosebleedy bugmen that make their appearance inside anime. Or sort of the boyish characters that aren't particularly masculine. So on a superficial reading of anime, a lot of anime has this Victorian aesthetic, very, very romantic. Of course, it comes from the Regency era, so it has to have that romantic dimension to it, right? Or, the romanticism comes from the Regency era. You're thinking to yourself, oh man, this is based. This is the vision for the future. We're all going to be like in Victorian outfits, and everyone who's watching this, they're getting the same thing, right? They're taking in this aesthetic, and along with the aesthetic is this virtue that has to necessarily be there. Ooh, it was about 3 years into my anime obsession when I realized that really nobody, that both basically everyone in the anime genre was a progressive. Now, I hadn't really learned my lesson that progressivism was pure chaos at that stage. So my lesson I took from being part of that community was that I needed to become more progressive. And so I adopted my kind of fuddy-duddy beliefs to fit in with the crowd. This is high school. Of course, everyone does this. We all modify our behavior to fit into the crowd. In some sense, that's healthy, right? But eventually, slowly over the course of my 20s, I became very, very progressive. And then slowly I began rebuilding my kind of more conservative sensibilities that I had early in high school. And I kind of returned to a lot of Victorian novels, and I kind of fell in love with the Victorian aesthetic. This is something that Millennial Woes and I have in common. We both sort of fell in love with the Jeremy Brent version of Sherlock Holmes. So if anyone loves Sherlock Holmes, this is a subjective opinion, of course, but the best Sherlock Holmes ever to appear in video form is the Sherlock Holmes played by Jeremy Brent, which was syndicated on the BBC and appeared in the United States on PBS. And what made that Sherlock Holmes so good is that Jeremy Brent's a great actor. I love him. As Sherlock Holmes, he's very well cast. They're very faithful to the Arthur Conan Doyle short stories. Unlike a lot of other versions of Sherlock Holmes that try to sex it up or take deviations, this is very much an orthodox reading of the original stories, which is always nice, in my opinion. Although you can argue that people do that too much these days. the third thing, the real good thing about it is that the people, the producers that made the Jeremy Brent Sherlock Holmes series from the 90s, they went to great lengths to capture a realistic picture of what it was like to live in the Victorian era. And because of that, because of this and a few other things, I got really into the Victorian era, sort of in my late-ish 20s, right? I think this was when I was living in Portland. And so I was like, oh man, I really want to get into this. And now, I wasn't really into anime at that time because by that time I was observing my friends from the anime group, and I had noticed this tendency of anime fans to move from a love of anime to the worst types of progressivism. Very, very shrill forms of feminism, very, very backbiting forms of progressivism. They were canceling each other before cancel culture was a thing on a macrocosmic scale. So it was obvious that whatever anime was, it didn't contain the virtue of the Victorian era in it. But around that time, a new subculture was coming up, which was steampunk. And so very briefly, I got into steampunk until I realized two things. Steampunk culture has no substance to it. Unlike cyberpunk, there are no great books of steampunk fiction. It's 100% pure aesthetic. It's 100% pure copying from Jules Verne with no additional interesting ideas incorporated into it. Furthermore, the SJW presence in steampunk was like anime times a million. It was the most toxic environment ever. It was the only thing they took from the Victorian era was the moral umbrage and snottiness. That was it. Other than that, it was pure progressive politics and degeneracy, with a good layer of moral superiority layered on with zero justification. That was one of the most poisonous communities I've ever seen. And I'm very glad to say that my fascination with that subculture lasted for weeks. Okay, so I'm sorry that I digressed so much from the super chat, and I guess if I have to answer super chats at 10 p.m. tonight because this gets stopped because people are coming home soon, so be it. But I want to give good answers. People are paying good money, right? Well, I don't know. Are digressions good answers? Whatever. Okay, well, what's the actual question? Okay, so how can we integrate aesthetically and culturally this world into our modern culture? I don't have a good answer for the aesthetic portion. I believe that beauty can save the world to a certain degree. And I absolutely believe that. And if we're talking about actual art, like the actual art that comes from that era, I would agree that there's a hole there. By hole, I mean an opportunity there for reactionaries to use the aesthetics of the Victorian era to try to bring people in line with the moral vision and the vision for humanity that era seemed to promise. However, if it's the superficial romantic form of the Victorian era without the deeper artistic elements that might have been included in a picture like The Scapegoat, in my opinion, forget about it. And people, I had this conversation with Fritz Imperial. I don't know if Fritz Imperial is still making videos. I hope he is. I really enjoyed his content while he was still doing political content. But one of my disagreements, a frequent thing that we discussed is what is the problem with Romanticism as a movement? And that is it is so easy to kitschify. The aesthetics of steampunk and the aesthetics of anime, insofar as Victorian, is kitsch. It is the aesthetics. It is the superficial aesthetics of the era, minus any kind of challenging artistic concept that would actually encourage one to try to mimic the moral implications involved in the original artistic pieces themselves. Good art from the Romantic era, insofar as there is good art from the Romantic era, I tend to not like it as much, but I've got a romantic piece of art right up in front of us here, right? And I use this as a jumping off point from a moral lesson, right? So there has to be something here. But the aesthetic is not, oh wait, here is a representational piece of art that has very feminine looking women in corsets and very dapper looking men in top hats. Or here's not like a very, very pristine landscape that looks like a photograph taken from a very, very dynamic era of time. That cannot be the lesson. Good art has to have a dimension to it that challenges us, that makes us try to figure out, what is this art telling me right now? Now, this is something that my wife and I were walking around Victoria a few days ago. After our quarantine, it was a pleasure to walk around a lovely city. Maybe I docked myself by telling me roughly where I was, right? But like a lot of cities on the coast of the Pacific Northwest, Victoria, actually more than any others, has a large amount of Victorian architecture. Now, this Victorian architecture is juxtaposed next to modern architecture, which all has large modernist and abstract art elements to it. And my wife said that she really didn't like abstract art. And I stood up and I defended abstract art. I'm like, abstract art is really good if it was used in the right context. Abstract art is good for what it is. The problem is that we let abstract art conquer a public square. Abstract art is good because you project yourself onto it and then you get yourself back from it. It is a great intellectual exercise. For instance, if you ever have look up this game called Exquisite Corpse. It was invented by Salvador Dali and Buñuel in the 1930s, I believe. They were both famous modernists. I don't know if you'd call them abstractists, they were surrealists, but it's the same kind of thing. The idea is to get a reflection of your own ideas back towards yourself and then learn something from it. Okay. Okay, so a lot of reactions like, oh, it's terrible, like it's just a dot, right? You're supposed to approach abstract art by just letting your mind wander into it and then to feed back into it. And then it's like meditation. It's like emptying yourself of thoughts and then hearing your thoughts come back to yourself in them with this minor amount of input. That being what it is good. The problem with abstract art is we used it way, way too much and we used it in the wrong contexts. We took something that should have been like a meditation and then we said, oh, because meditation is good, meditation can replace novels, right? So as opposed, you open up a novel and there's nothing in it. Okay, well, great, maybe I can flip pages while I meditate, but it's kind of a shitty replacement for what used to be a medium that communicated a story. And with abstract art, we took a public square that used to say something and we replaced it with a public square that now says nothing, right? But in defense of abstract art, if you use abstract art correctly, you can use it to challenge yourself. You can use it effectively. There is a place for abstract art. It's a much smaller place than was done in the 20th century and the early 21st century, but it can be used effectively. The problem with kitsch is that it is the form of the Victorian age without any of the challenging elements, or without the requirement that you try to find a challenging spiritual element in a piece of art. Nobody ever had an interesting idea, or if somebody has an interesting idea. Okay, so here we go. This is a good idea. Okay, so what's the best work of steampunk fiction, in my opinion? Almost all of it's bad, but insofar as there is a good steampunk, it is The Difference Engine by William Gibson, also the inventor of cyberpunk with the novel Neuromancer. The reason why The Difference Engine is better than all other forms of steampunk fiction is that The Difference Engine is an implicit critique on the modern world. William Gibson is experimenting. He's saying the modern world decided to go down the cyberpunk route, but it could have gone down the steampunk route. So this is an implicit critique of what our world would have looked like if we had done things differently. That's more challenging. Every other steampunk book I've ever read is basically a book with the moral content of young adult fiction or a superficial dumb anime with a Victorian or Edwardian aesthetic poured in on it afterwards. We have to avoid that. So finally, after all of these digressions, I guess I'm finally going to arrive at something that approaches an answer to Aristocratic Owl. But what I would say is the way that you incorporate a love of the Victorian age into something that can meaningfully impact our modern world is to find the challenging elements of that art and then ask the right questions of our age. It is not to copy pasta their superficial kitsch aesthetics onto modern propaganda and then call that art because it looks the right way. That's essentially turning art into kitsch. Oikos, which is, so you mentioned here Roger Scruton's concept of oikos, which is, I don't think, a word that they used a lot in the Victorian era, but if you look at Victorian fiction, like something like Alice in Wonderland, right? Alice in Wonderland embodies a kind of oikos that is completely... I don't know if I've ever said this in a video, and I did a long video on Alice in... I guess I did say this in the Trad Codex video. I did a Trad Codex on Alice in Wonderland, right? And Alice in Wonderland is a Victorian child visits a topsy-turvy land where everyone is insane, and hilarity or adventure ensues. But if you reread Alice in Wonderland from a modern perspective as an adult, more than likely not, you're going to find the most interesting thing about Wonderland to not be any of the Wonderland characters, but to be Alice herself. Why? Well, because Alice herself embodies oikos. Alice herself is more at home in her identity as being a little girl than most little girls of her age in the modern world would be. I don't want to say anything about this, but I look at the youth, and this is something I look at my relatives who are girls. I worry about the male children too, but just because we're talking about Alice from Alice in Wonderland, social media has been super destructive for the 9 to 13 age girls. So the same age that Alice in Wonderland was in the Victorian age. They are massively insecure. They don't feel like they belong in any one place. What makes Alice from Alice in Wonderland so endearing is that she belongs to a house. She belongs to a community. She belongs to England. She belongs to an English way of thinking. And now this thing, the Victorian girl, is being transported to this other thing called Wonderland. It wouldn't be nearly as charming if you dumped a similarly aged girl from the modern world into Wonderland. I don't know if you didn't get a reaction, because the modern little girl is so bombarded with things outside their comfort level that they don't really have a location of home to depart from. So indeed, I think you're on the right track. What goes is implicitly in most Victorian works of fiction, and if you could transport that concept to the modern world, I think you'd have something to work with. This is something that Vosh, being the bugman that he is, this is oikos. Let's link it all back, right? Oikos is literally the thing the bugman doesn't have. Oikos, aka love of home, aka love of ancestor, aka comfortableness in your own skin, in all senses of the word, is literally the something that the modern white Gentile bugman rejects. It's literally the thing that Vosh can't have and never has. Okay, perfect. So now I'm completely done with that question. Way big digression. Thank you very much for your generosity. I'm just going to have to work through these things one by one. I already did the one by Ghost of Chesterton. Now I'm going to do the one by Jonathan Reelman for €5. What's your Linux distro and what WMDE are you using? What's acronyms? Okay, the Linux distro that I am using is Mint Linux. I'll let you in a little secret. Distros don't matter. They literally don't. As soon as I installed Mint on this system, I deinstalled my graphical user interface and installed a completely new one. and then I deinstalled half another other programs. I reinstalled a new one. My server uses Ubuntu. I deinstalled a whole bunch of Ubuntu software and I reinstalled it. Uh, at the end of that whole process of reconfiguring your system, you probably aren't going to even notice what distribution you're using. WM. I don't, Windows Manager. Oh, Windows, is that Windows Manager? Okay, so the Windows Manager I'm using right now is GNOME. I don't know. Is it better than I have zero opinion of GNOME. Wait, maybe it's Cinnamon. I see. I don't even know or care. Cinnamon came with the Mint distribution, and I installed GNOME, but I don't even remember which one is my default one that I boot into, because I just go straight to the command line, or I type hotkeys in to launch things. So I never really feel like I interact with uh, Windows managers. I'm not so sure what DE is, but I'll tell you the two other things I get asked for Linux users is my preferred text editor, which is Vim. Yeah, I know I'm super late like that. I'm not a I'm not a Vim samurai. It's just what I was raised with. I use Vim, and my favorite shell is Bash. Uh, I um I was very tempted to use Fish shell because Fish is an inside joke between me and my wife, but I never got used to Fish shell. And it like and all I once shell languages just don't matter. I mean, just whatever you're comfortable in. There's virtually no difference between Z shell and C shell and Bash shell and Fish shell. It's just what you're comfortable with. And the same thing is true for the distributions. If you like the distribution, it's the distribution for you. They don't matter. Just whatever. It's like asking what your favorite color is. I guess that's fine that way, right? So the answer is Mint, which I don't care about, GNOME, and then I do prefer Bash and Vim, and I would be consciously aware that I was using Bash and Vim on any distribution of Linux. Um, okay, I've heard. Okay, so the other part of the question is not a question. So I heard that I heard that Gentoo Linux is the best one, or Kali Linux is the best one, or Arch Linux. If you ask anybody, if you ask anyone uh, what the best is, you usually get Kali, Arch, or Gentoo. But again, I just don't care. So thank you. Um, so Aristocratic Owl answers his own question here and says, I recommend for you or anyone who's interested in Linux to start with Manjaro. Yeah, I've heard that one's good too. Um, Look, as long as the Linux distribution in question has apt-get and takes .deb packages in its package manager, and I don't have to spend an obscenely long time setting up apt-get, which I'm not so sure. Maybe setting up apt-get isn't hard on any Linux distribution at this stage. As long as you've got apt-get, I'm cool. As long as you have Bash shell, I'm cool. As long as you have Vim, I'm cool. I really don't care as long as you have those three things and you can run Apache and a few other programs, then which I'm reasonably sure all Linux distributions do, then I'm cool. Aristocratic Owl for USD Aristocratic Owl for $10. Sorry, it says I recommend for you or anyone who's interested in Linux to start. That's not the tweet. Pardon me. He says I would recommend trying out Lutris for a game emulator. Yes, I agree. Lutris is good. That's how I play Magic the Gathering Arena. It also seamlessly plays StarCraft and Diablo 1 and 2, which is awesome. So, legacy games work great on Lutris. Here's one thing I will praise Mint Linux for doing better than Ubuntu. When I installed Mint Linux, it handled the proprietary drivers on my system so much better than did Ubuntu. Maybe I was using an old version of Ubuntu, but I did that way, way better. So, and for that reason, I couldn't play anything that had even the smallest amount of 3D acceleration in on it when I was using Ubuntu. And that became available to me when I switched to Mint. But not that that matters. It's not like I'm playing lots of video games anyway, right? Occasionally occasionally me and my wife will play Magic Draft when it's available for free online. Um, BHW for $3. Do you think Yarvin's clear pill is a good faith take to protect dissidents against impending totalitarianism? Well, that's easy. I definitely think it's good faith. Whether it's correct is a different question. I'm pretty sure Yarvin isn't a Fed, right? Yarvin basically built a large amount of the dissident right sphere as it exists currently. That would have to be, if he turns out to be someone who built it to subvert it, that would have to be the longest term, most inside game of subversion ever accomplished. That would be some sixth dimensional chess right there. I mean, that would be some deep cover. That's all I'm saying. And I don't know. I mean, I guess the one form of distant reactionary politics that Yarvin has really spoke out against is white nationalism. And his critiques of white nationalism have been very similar to my critiques of white nationalism. And I think they're just true, and white nationalists have never been able to answer those critiques. The problem with white nationalism in any of its forms, in its 1.0 form, in its 2.0 form, in its alt-right form, the problem the two problems has been in the long term, it lacks an aesthetic and a religious vision of what humanity can be. Even from people like Millennial Woes, who were deeply involved in that sphere of white nationalism, his best videos are fundamentally about art and spirituality. His best talks are fundamentally about art and spirituality. I don't even think Millennial Woes realizes why early Millennial Woes videos were so good. Early Millennial Woes videos weren't actually about white nationalism. Early Millennial Woes videos were about the decrepitness of the modern world and about the need for an imaginative framework that goes beyond the decrepitness of the modern world. Maybe my tastes differ from most of Millennial Woes' audience, and I'm sure he could correct me on that. But for my money, the truly special videos, even that came out of that early, white nationalist 2.0 type deal, they all were reactionary and not white nationalists. So the difficulty is with this Curtis Yarvin isn't in good faith thing. He's been right. He's been predictively correct too many times. And the critics that constantly point to his ethnicity or point to the sort of indolent nature of the clear pill itself, their predictions have been terrible. And in a near-term perspective, to complement on the far-term perspective, the net result of all white nationalism 2.0's actions have been to make their enemies more powerful and their allies weaker. I'm sorry, but that's the net effect of it. Richard Spencer has been a disaster for the international right wing. He essentially exposed them to so much ridicule over the course of his career, and he's given them so few new ideas. With someone like Greg Johnson from Countercurrents, I've had huge disagreements with Greg Johnson in the past, and I think I have a standing invitation to talk with him or debate with him or something like that. But at least in that instance, with Greg Johnson, it's like, okay, like he has these cringe takes, but he has some interesting new ideas on the other hand, right? With Spencer, he never had any interesting ideas, in my opinion. So he was just a disaster through and through for the right wing movement. I don't know. And so when two people, you know, when someone says if you do that you're going to get hurt, and the other person says no I won't, hold my beer, and then 2 hours later, as the meme goes, the person who said hold my beer is in the hospital, relying on the person who told him not to do that for his life support. I don't think that the person who's in the hospital is in good faith by then turning around and saying, "Oh, he's in bad faith." I think that there has to be some recognition of the predictive validity of NRX's theories and of Curtis Yarvin's theories, regardless of what people don't like about him. And I understand why he culturally clashes with people. He's a blue stater. He says after every word. I know I'm horrible at elocution. I'm in no position to criticize him. But I understand why he gets on people's nerves. But man, for a political theory that has had as much explanatory power as his formulations have had in the right-wing sphere, and given how little predictive power his opponents have, I really think that the ball is in his critics' court. Obviously, no one can look into anyone's soul and ultimately discover. For all I know, maybe he is a deep cover agent, but I find it highly unlikely. And for the time being, you need to come up with a defeater political theory to NRX. If you can beat NRX as a predictive and descriptive political theory for how politics actually works, we can start from there. Last night I watched a YouTube video, a conversation between Don the Pleb and Aaron McIntyre. And I was really frustrated with Don the Pleb because Aaron McIntyre kept on putting a really real challenge to Don the Pleb. Don the Pleb is kind of this realpolitik guy, but he's way more normie than NRX. And he has this idea that we're gonna, it's this red state thing where they're like, we just got to do this, like, no nonsense. We got to take power and then we got to take it back. Like you can just seize power by pushing a button. And Don the Pleb has a very well rehearsed argument for why parallelism isn't going to work. But all the while, Aaron McIntyre said, parallelism is just going to work better than anything else you're proposing. And I felt, and I have a good respect for Don the Pleb. I respect the man. I respect his content. He's a good content creator. Everyone subscribed to him. But I felt in that conversation that Aaron McIntyre's challenge was not answered by Don the Pleb. And I felt that was frustrating because Aaron McIntyre's challenge was the same challenge as Don the Pleb's challenge. It's the same challenge as my challenge to Don the Pleb. One thing I will say is that parallelism, Don the Pleb is right, that parallelism will not work independently of anything else. But what Don the Pleb thinks is parallelism will not work without the presence of Republican politicians at the state level or in Washington. Nope. Wrong faucet of power. Parallelism will not work without defenders of those parallel institutions on all sides of the conversation, in the Democratic Party, in the Republican Party, and more importantly, speaking the language of Blue America and attending the same events as Blue America, living inside urban areas. There need to be a vanguard of people who live in blue areas that rhetorically defend the existence of parallel institutions. Let's take the most successful parallel project of our lifetimes, the State of Israel. Which party is the pro-Israel party? Okay, maybe leaving aside the last 5 years, let's take from 1980 to 2016. Who was the pro-Israel party? Was there a pro-Israel party? Did people have a big I in front of their names that indicated that they were a pro-Israel politician? Or, alternatively, when you went to New York or Washington, D.C. and attended a venue with politicians, or a venue with artists, or a venue with businessmen or bankers, and they all have different parties. These are all different parties. But if I went to a party of any elite class in an urban area, I could pretty much guarantee you there would probably be about 20% of people in that room who believe that Israel should exist as a Jewish state in some form. That's a kind of representation in the elite classes that is much more valuable than forcing a Republican politician into Congress who you already know is going to be a symbolic pariah to begin with. So I think, Don is right that parallelism does not work in isolation. But the difficulty is that he doesn't realize that the necessary complement to parallelism is the very kind of soft power that he doesn't explicitly poo-poo, but it seems to a large degree he implicitly poo-poos every time he scoffs at people who are more in the neo-reaction sphere. But, that being what it is, let's keep on going. Okay. Okay, so there we go. Now here's my friend Skydancer. Um, okay, so Skydancer for $5. Thank you very much. You are responding to Vosh's rhetoric with dialectic, which won't be effective for those like him. Also, we should consider the likely possibility that he and other bread tubers are artificially propped up rather than being organically popular. Okay, yeah, okay, so I absolutely agree. I am using dialectic against rhetoric, and that's never do that, kids. At least not as a right winger, at least as a movement without a very, very powerful vanguard. Never speak truth to power, except for unless you're religiously obligated to do so, I should say, unless you're morally obligated to do so. But never speak truth to power just because it's truth and not because it's a moral need. That's just stupid and unwise and unprudent, in my opinion. It's like telling the wife of your boss that they're ugly during a dinner party. It might be true, but it's stupid. So I'm right, and you're absolutely right. I am using dialectic against rhetoric if I was talking to Vosh. I'm not talking to Vosh. Perhaps I didn't make this clear in either my initial video or this live stream. I am trying to speak to Vosh's fans, not Vosh himself. So that is, I think that's a necessary caveat. I am. Have we been going on? Oh, we've been going on for 3 hours. Okay, so we're making good time. I think. I probably should. I probably should say that let's try to wrap up the super chats. If I'm suddenly interrupted and I have to close the live stream, then I will do another live stream tonight to finish the super chats and take more questions. But if you could just finish up the super chats in the next 5 minutes, and I'll try to answer as many of them as possible before I have to reschedule this. But okay, so on the second of Skydancer's questions, have we entertained the possibility that Vosh's popularity is artificial? Yeah, I guess so. The problem is that I've, I never thought this way about Vosh, but I thought this way about ContraPoints. ContraPoints being very much more of a shitlib than Vosh is. Vosh being, by his nature, more anti-status quo than ContraPoints is, who tends to be more conciliatory. I thought that ContraPoints was artificially propped up. That was until every one of my progressive friends, or not everyone, but a good number of my progressive friends in 2018 and 2019 started telling me about ContraPoints. Once you have a lot of people in real life saying that they like something, well, sure, maybe the appeal of Vosh or ContraPoints started as an artificial push, but at some point, real people started catching on and following the crowd. And because they have real-world friends, I've met real-world ContraPoints friends, and I've met at least one real-world person who liked Vosh. So it's not completely artificial. A lot of things online are fake it until you make it. If you are in possession of a fully monetized channel, if you're in possession of a channel that is not being throttled by the YouTube algorithm, then you can you can really grow indefinitely, right? And a few viral videos here and there can basically make or break you. Like, I don't think ContraPoints has ever had a phenomenal video essay, and I don't think dressing up in costumes is really an original idea or even very good. I hate ContraPoints' content. Um, but the fact that ContraPoints is so popular is that they made themselves the face of left YouTube right at the point when leftists felt like they wanted to have a presence on YouTube. So the popularity fed into their popularity. So I don't know, Skydancer. I can assure you that these people have real life fans. I've met them, but that certainly doesn't preclude that they were jump started by the establishment. And I would almost kind of be surprised if they weren't jump started by the establishment. Just to take somebody who we know is complete, whose fan base is completely artificial. Faraday Speaks is a YouTuber or a content creator whose fan base is 100% artificial. The only people who like that YouTuber are leftists who think that they're going to cash in on his phenomenon, or people from the mainstream who are trying to use his celebrity to push their whole alt-right pipeline narrative, which he did not invent, even though he claimed to several times, which the New York Times, which other people invented, and which he essentially just jumped onto in order to be part of that clout. That's 100% artificial. But what do you see if you look at the online career of Faraday Speaks? You see what artificial pushes do in isolation of any appeal. Right? Faraday Speaks is an incredibly hard to like person in his own personality, unlike Vosh and ContraPoints, who have more, I wouldn't say likable personalities, but they're more flamboyant. There's more stuff there to like. ContraPoints gets primed into their popularity. Faraday Speaks popularity shoots up like a bottle rocket because it's promoted, and then it slams down. 100% artificial. So, that's what a genuine pure artificial hop looks like, which in my mind does not look like Vosh or like ContraPoints. ContraPoints and Vosh look like people who were artificially started but who found an organic audience after a while. Since you complained, so this is for keyboard strokes, can't read it for $5. Since you complained about popular Christian literature, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis book recommendations, since you complained about popular Christian literature recommendations, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, a book recommendation is Martyr's Mirror by Theomin von Braut. Popular among Amish and Mennonites. Lead by example. Have a recommended book list or an online book club. That's a good point. So, for a while, I thought I'd do a recommended book list as sort of an ongoing live stream series with my wife. We didn't have enough time to do that as the impact of childcare and work sort of mounted on us. So maybe what I'll have is sort of an online book recommendation list as part of my other alternative online identity. I have a web page, so perhaps we could do that. Oh, okay, perfect. And here is Hunger for $3 USD. Dave streaming anytime after 1 a.m. is like breaking a natural law. Very unsettling for the East Coast audience. Okay. Yeah, that the breaking of natural law is called vacation. Okay, okay, so I'm gonna read the other ones here on the donation tab. Okay, so here is Nicholas Dolinger. Let me make sure that I'm getting this out properly. That's not working. Oh, perhaps this might be a YouTube. Okay, so this is obviously a YouTube super chat. Um, Nicholas Nicholas Dolinger for $12 USA. An excerpt from my debut poetry collection, Sunbathing I Want to. This portion addresses Kanye West, sexuality, original sin, and wind power in Massachusetts. Well, thank you very much. There's a book link there. I don't, as a practice, follow links during live streams, but thank you very, very much for the super chat. I appreciate it. Um, Dimitri Garlic for $5 USA. What do you think of the poetry of Mencius Moldbug occasionally publishes or published on UR and his Substack? How would you recommend getting into poetry? Where to start? Okay, so I don't think much of Moldbug's poetry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Curtis. Stick to your prose. I'm not one to speak. I've written poetry in the past, and it sucks. I don't know. Maybe I'll publish it as a joke or something, but poetry is an incredibly hard thing to do. It's usually better as a joke. But on the second question, which I feel a little bit more able to answer, poetry, I feel like I've answered this a lot, but I'll say it again because it bears repeating. Poetry does not translate into our modern age very well because modern people don't do two things with poetry that you need to do with poetry. So, what do most people do with poetry? They okay, so this is what people do with poetry. Do I have a book here? No, I don't. I'm going to pretend I have a book. They buy a poetry book and they think, oh my God, I'm so intellectual buying this book of poetry. They get it back, and then they sit down with it that night and they read it. And you read a poem, the first page, and you're like, oh, that's good. And then you read another one. And you're like, oh, okay, I'm getting kind of bored. And then you close the book, put it down on your nightstand. You never pick it up. If the poetry book is lucky, it gets moved from the nightstand to the coffee table. And in the coffee table, or the bathroom, if you're Walter White, that's a Breaking Bad reference, it gets moved to the coffee table or the bathroom, where you hope, possibly, some unsuspecting guest will pick it up and flip through it and be entertained, or, better yet, think that you're the kind of intellectual person that reads poetry in their spare time, even though no one does. That's called the wrong way to get into poetry. This is the right way to get into poetry. And listen carefully. And this is a recommendation for people. The two ways poetry is actually meant to be consumed is to be memorized and to be recited and to be listened to. That's three. The three fingers appearing on camera. Modern people don't do that, so modern people don't love poetry. If you want to get into poetry, my recommendation, this is a buying recommendation, I should have an Amazon Associates thing. Buy poetry on record. There is this recording series called Poetry on Record, 1850 to 2000 and something. It's a set of CDs. Obviously, that's way obsolete. I bought it when CDs were still a thing. But this series is amazing. It's the original authors of the poetry reading the poetry on CD. And I put that CD set in my car when I had an 8-hour road trip. Most of my road trips are up and down the coast. And I listened to that CD collection. And there's 5 CDs. It goes from Lord Tennyson, and believe it or not, there actually are recordings of Lord Tennyson. You can barely hear them, but there are recordings of Lord Tennyson on an illicit phonograph. It goes from Lord Tennyson to Maya Angelou. And I hate Maya Angelou, but she's on there, I believe, right? And I was mesmerized by it. It was a religious experience. Hearing the poetry read out is amazing. And my wife loved it when I played it for her too. It's an amazing thing to listen to. And that will get you into that poet more than any little coffee table books that you buy, regardless of how good or recommended they are by people, ever will. Listen to the poetry, then read it. Second thing you need to do with poetry, memorize it. I'm not going to hurt your ears by I'm not going to hurt your ears by reciting poetry on stream from memory, because that's typically horrible. But take your favorite poem ever and memorize it, and then recite it to yourself in your quiet moments. This is one thing that I've tried to do, is have moments of silence where I'm not checking Twitter. Deleting Twitter has helped that. Having a poem you're trying to memorize and then reciting it in your brain is a great way to do that. Memorize the poetry, and then once you've really memorize it. Try, if there's an appropriate time, to recite it to somebody and see if they like your recitation of it. And it's a personal challenge. It's like cooking a good meal. And make sure it's short. Make sure it's like a William Blake poem. William Blake is perfect because they're easy to memorize and they're good to recite. But if there's an appropriate moment, like a hiking trips are great for this. You know, you're out there in the wilderness and you're like, hey, I have this poem memorized. You know, you want to hear it? You know, try to recite it, and yeah, and if you're good at it, then you will communicate your love of that poem to somebody else. The poet that I like the most and that's still alive is Wendell Berry. I believe that's his name. I constantly get him confused with somebody else. So he did a poem that was very famous called "The Piece of Wild Things," which I love. And don't be pretentious and try. I mean, I don't know. You can do this if you want to, right? Don't be pretentious and try to like memorize really obscure poems. Memorize poems that you like. The famous poems are famous for a reason. The first poem I memorized was "Tiger, Tiger, Tiger" by Blake, and it happened to be that tiger was the first real word my son just said. So I'm gonna have a fun time really making that poem my poem. Tiger, Tiger is the most stereotypical William Blake poem. It's the poem everyone learns when they're in high school poetry class. Who cares? It's still good. But Wendell Berry did "The Piece of Wild Things" and other poems, and they're amazing. I think he's a Catholic distributist as well. But he's really, really good. And you know, I was working on his poems. It was also turned into a bluegrass song. But remember, listen, memorize, and recite. Do not read poetry out of a book. It's like reading poetry out of a book is like, people who are nerds will get this. It's like using miniature painting without thinning your paints. It's a recipe for a bad time, right? Get the book to memorize the poem. Know that you like the author by listening to a recitation, and then commit yourself to liking the poem by memorizing it, getting good at reciting it, and if you're feeling ambitious, recite the poem in a way that captures the imagination of the other person involved. I'm trying to get back on top of my prayer life this Lenten season, and that just means having little spaces of quiet time. This is something that I'm not prepared to do now, but I'm kicking myself for not doing this. I would like to end every one of my Distance series with a prayer or a poem, maybe both. And most good prayers are poetry. In my opinion, they qualify as such. So I would like to try to conform your life so that there is at least one place where it would be not inappropriate to recite a poem, and that's a life goal. Memorizing a poem that you could recite is another life goal, and since most people don't want life goals but consumer products, just buying that collection of poetry on record read by the authors of the poems themselves is a book recommendation that I just would recommend to anyone who's listening. I really wish I had an Amazon Associates link for that, because I just tell you to go out and buy it. I mean, or just steal it. I mean, I don't care. I mean, obviously, all those people are dead, so you're not giving them any money. I see Catholic Wench for $3 asking me what I want for dinner. Um, are you coming home soon? Okay, so you're on our way back, so I better close the stream off really quickly. Whatever you want for dinner is what I want for dinner. Thank you very, very much. And I appreciate the super chat that is essentially a donation to Entropy rather than a donation to rather than a donation to me. But there it is. Oh, am I gonna get through these things? Okay, guys. Here, so I don't get interrupted by my wife coming home, I'm going to do a very short follow up stream tonight that will be this stream part two, in which I'll answer the rest of the super chats that appeared on this stream. So, I apologize for cutting this stream short. I will get to all of your super chats then, and I thoroughly appreciate the time you've spent with me. But considering that people are about to come in the door and I've already gone on for over 3 hours, I will ask forgiveness of the people, and I will get to your super chat in part two tonight. And increasingly, since I said that I wanted to end every one of these streams with either a poetry, a poem, or a prayer, I will come prepared to read a poem and a prayer or a prayer for tonight. So anyway, I will. With that being said, I will leave the super chats as they are, and I will say I will see you tonight for the second part of this stream. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and I'll see you later.